It began far from the places most people associate with the Second World War, not in ruined cities or sweeping plains, but in forests, mountains, and frozen frontiers where silence itself felt hostile. The 6th SS Mountain Division, known as Nord, was formed for a kind of war few truly understood. This was not armored maneuver or rapid breakthrough. It was warfare at the edge of endurance, deep woods, narrow passes, bitter cold, and isolation so complete that units often felt forgotten by the world they were supposedly fighting for. From the start, this division was shaped by environment as much as ideology, and both would leave deep scars. Nord was not born elite. Its early formation was rushed. Training was uneven. Equipment was inadequate for the terrain it was expected to master. Many of its men were unfamiliar with true mountain warfare, yet they were sent north anyway, into regions where weather could kill faster than enemy fire. What they shared was not experience, but indoctrination. A belief system that framed hardship as proof of worth and suffering as virtue. The Northern Front did not care about belief. In Norway and Finland, the landscape dominated everything. Dense forests swallowed movement. Snow concealed danger and erased orientation. Temperatures dropped so low that weapons failed. Engines froze, and exposed skin became a liability. Supply lines stretched thin over impossible distances. Communication faltered. Units operated in near isolation, fighting not only an enemy, but hunger, cold, and exhaustion that never truly eased. Early combat revealed painful truths. The division struggled. Coordination broke down. Losses mounted quickly. Against experienced opponents who understood the terrain, Nord paid heavily for its lack of preparation. Morale suffered. Confidence evaporated. What propaganda promised, reality dismantled. And yet, the division did not disappear. It adapted, slowly, unevenly, and at high cost. Survivors learned how to move through forests without sound, how to dig into frozen ground, how to endure weeks of cold without relief. Over time, Nord became more capable militarily, but it never escaped the system it served. As elsewhere within the SS structure, ideology traveled with the unit wherever it went. Operations were conducted with brutality towards civilians and prisoners. Anti-partisan warfare blurred into punishment. Villages were destroyed. Fear became a tool. These actions were not accidents of terrain or stress alone. They reflected the organization's worldview, one that erased moral boundaries and replaced them with obedience. The war dragged on. While attention focused on massive battles elsewhere, Nord remained locked in a grinding struggle of attrition at the margins of the conflict. Progress was measured in meters. Losses were constant. Reinforcements arrived unprepared for the conditions awaiting them. The landscape consumed men steadily, without drama. By the later stages of the war, the division was pulled into collapsing fronts farther south, carrying its experience and its damage with it. What remained of Nord fought not for victory but for survival within a system that offered neither mercy nor escape. Equipment shortages worsened, command cohesion frayed. The sense of inevitability pressed in from all sides. When the war finally ended, there was no triumph, no redemption, only surrender, capture, and reckoning. The history of the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord is not one of heroic mountain fighters or romantic endurance. It is a story of how ideology placed men into environments they were unprepared for, demanded loyalty beyond reason, and normalized violence as policy. It shows how suffering can harden into cruelty when systems reward obedience over humanity. This is not a story told to admire. It is told to understand how extreme environments amplify the consequences of extreme belief, how hardship does not create virtue by itself, how professionalism, when fused with ideology, can still serve destructive ends. Tonight, we return to the cold frontier, to the forests and frozen ground where war dragged on in silence, to a division shaped as much by weather as by doctrine, to the uncomfortable truths that live far from the spotlight of history. Before we continue, let me pause and ask you something quietly human. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time has settled around you there? Is it late, early, or somewhere in between where the day feels suspended? And one final invitation. different from any other in this series. If these long, careful explorations of difficult history give you space to think, slow down, or sit with truths that are not simple but necessary, consider subscribing, not as a click, but as a choice to return whenever you want. History told without haste, without myth, and without turning away. Take your time. This is heavy history, and it deserves to be heard slowly. The archaeologist's shovel strikes something that shouldn't exist. It's August 2018, somewhere in the Norwegian Arctic, 77 years after anyone last stood on this frozen ground. Dr. Henrik Olsen brushes away centuries of accumulated moss and tundra to reveal what looks like a trench, perfectly preserved, carved into bedrock. Inside, he finds items that tell an impossible story. German helmets, ammunition crates stamped with the year 1941, and something stranger, a diary, its pages frozen but readable, belonging to a soldier named Klaus Becker. The final entry stops mid-sentence. The date is November 7th, 1941. The temperature that day, according to Finnish meteorological records, was minus 43 degrees Celsius. Becker never wrote again. This is the Arctic Front. While historians have written thousands of books about D-Day, Stalingrad, and the Battle of Britain, almost no one remembers this place. Here, more than 20,000 men of the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord fought a war against two enemies simultaneously: the Soviet Red Army and the Arctic itself. The temperature swung 80 degrees Celsius between summer and winter. The midnight sun in June gave way to polar darkness in December. Men dug foxholes in permafrost that took 8 hours to complete instead of 30 minutes. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers across roadless wilderness. And at the center of this frozen hell was Murmansk, a port city that mattered more to the outcome of World War II than most people will ever know. This is the story of how elite German mountain troops were sent to capture it, how they failed spectacularly, and how that failure changed everything. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa launches at dawn. 3 million German soldiers crash into the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. History remembers this moment, the greatest invasion ever attempted. But history forgets the northernmost prong of this attack. While panzer divisions race toward Moscow and infantry floods into Ukraine, a smaller force crosses the Finnish-German border, heading northeast. Their objective is not Moscow or Leningrad. It's Murmansk, an Arctic port that sits 200 kilometers beyond the Arctic Circle. The men stepping off trains into the midnight sun that morning are SS troops, supposedly elite, trained in mountain warfare in the Bavarian Alps. They wear regulation summer uniforms because someone in Berlin decided June meant summer. Within 48 hours, more than 200 men will be hospitalized for exposure, not from cold, but from heat exhaustion and swarms of Arctic mosquitoes so thick that soldiers cannot breathe without covering their mouths. The plan seems simple on maps drawn in Berlin. 6th SS Mountain Division Nord will advance from Finnish territory, cover 200 kilometers of Arctic tundra, and capture Murmansk before autumn. The city is the Soviet Union's only year-round ice-free Arctic port. Allied convoys carrying American tanks, British aircraft, and critical supplies dock there. Cut Murmansk, and you cut the Soviet Union's northern lifeline. On paper, it's brilliant strategy. In reality, no one in Berlin has ever seen the Arctic. No one understands that there are no roads, no cover, no concealment. The tundra appears solid until you step on it and sink to your knees in bog. The landscape is flat, meaning every movement is visible for kilometers in every direction. And the Soviets know this terrain. They've lived here. They've survived here. The Germans are tourists with guns, about to learn the most expensive lesson of the war. The first casualties aren't from Soviet bullets. Unteroffizier Werner Hoffmann writes in his diary on June 25th, 3 men in my platoon hospitalized today. Not wounded, just sick. The medic says it's exhaustion. But how can you be exhausted before you even fight? The answer is simple. The Arctic exhausts you just by existing. Summer temperatures reach 30 degrees Celsius. But there's no shade. The midnight sun never sets, destroying circadian rhythms and making sleep nearly impossible. Mosquitoes and black flies form clouds so dense that sentries abandon their posts. Men dig into the tundra to escape insects and discover that beneath the surface layer, the ground is permanently frozen permafrost. You cannot dig a proper foxhole. You cannot create adequate cover. You are exposed always to whatever the land decides to do to you. And that's summer. Winter is still 4 months away. The Soviets watch the German advance with professional interest. The 14th Army defending Murmansk numbers approximately 150,000 troops, outnumbering Nord by more than 7-1. Many are local conscripts who grew up hunting reindeer across this exact terrain. They know where the ravines hide, where the solid ground ends and the bogs begin, where to position mortars for maximum effect. When the Germans attack, the Soviets don't fight them directly. They let the land fight first. German infantry advance in parade ground formations because there's nowhere to take cover. Soviet artillery observers, positioned on the few hills that exist, watch the Germans march like ants across a white tablecloth. The first barrage kills 40 men in 30 seconds. The survivors scatter, looking for cover that doesn't exist. Some try to dig in. The permafrost defeats their shovels. Others run forward towards Soviet positions, hoping close combat will negate the artillery advantage. They discover too late that the Soviets have prepared defense in depth, trenches blasted from rock with explosives, concealed machine gun nests, pre-registered kill zones. The Germans take 300 casualties in the first week. They advance 15 kilometers. They need another 185 to reach Murmansk. Back in Berlin, Hitler's headquarters receives optimistic reports. Army Group North requests reinforcements for the main thrust toward Leningrad. Hitler refuses. He's convinced Murmansk is the key. If it falls, Allied convoys stop. Soviet resistance in the north collapses, and Finland becomes a secure German ally instead of a reluctant partner. What Hitler doesn't understand, what no one in Berlin understands, is that Murmansk's value is precisely why the Soviets will defend it with everything they have. Stalin knows that 22% of all Allied aid to the USSR comes through Murmansk's port. American Lend-Lease Sherman tanks drive off ships and straight to the front. British Hawker Hurricanes fly from Murmansk's airfields to defend Moscow. Food shipments prevent starvation in Leningrad. Murmansk is not a peripheral objective. It is existential, and the men defending it know this. By September 1941, the offensive has stalled. 6th SS Mountain Division Nord has advanced 30 kilometers in 3 months. They are still more than 160 kilometers from their objective. Casualty reports tell a strange story. For every man killed or wounded by Soviet fire, 3 more are evacuated for medical reasons unrelated to combat: frostbite in summer, exhaustion, malnutrition, psychological breakdown. The division's medical officers report something they call Arctic fatigue, soldiers who are physically healthy but mentally incapable of continuing. Company commanders send letters up the chain of command describing men who stare at nothing, unable to respond to orders. The letters are filed and ignored. Berlin does not want to hear that elite SS troops are defeated by landscape and weather. That doesn't fit the narrative. So, officially, the offensive continues. Unofficially, every soldier in Nord knows they're not advancing anymore. They're surviving. And survival in the Arctic is its own form of combat. Autumn arrives in late September with shocking speed. Temperatures drop 20 degrees Celsius in 48 hours. Rain turns to sleet, then snow. The mosquitoes disappear, replaced by wind that cuts through summer uniforms like they don't exist. Supply columns rushing winter gear north get stuck in early snows. The first cases of severe frostbite appear in October. Men lose toes, fingers, sometimes entire hands to cold. Field hospitals overflow. Medical evacuation trains run constantly. And the Soviets, who have spent the summer reinforcing their positions, watch and wait. They know what's coming. The Germans are about to experience their first Arctic winter. The Soviets have experienced dozens. This isn't a fair fight. It never was. November 7th, 1941. Klaus Becker, the soldier whose diary Dr. Olson will discover 77 years later, makes his final entry. Temperature -43 this morning. Heinrich froze to death in his sleep. We didn't know until morning formation. He looked peaceful. The cold doesn't hurt after a while. It just makes you tired. So tired. That's where the entry stops. Mid-sentence. Incomplete. Becker may have frozen while writing, or perhaps he simply had nothing left to say. His body was never recovered, never identified, never sent home. He became one of thousands of ghosts in the Arctic, men who vanished into the white emptiness and were forgotten by history. Until now. Until archaeologists started asking questions about a front that appeared in no textbooks, produced no famous battles, and somehow mattered more than anyone realized. This is their story. This is the story of the Forgotten Front. February 1941. In a snow-covered field outside Kirkenes, Norway, approximately 20,000 men stand in formation. They represent 12 different ethnic backgrounds, speak at least 8 different native languages, and have one thing in common. The Waffen-SS has deemed them acceptable for combat. This is the birth of the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord. It should not exist. The SS prides itself on racial purity, on selecting only the finest Germanic specimens for military service. But it's 1941, and Germany's war has outpaced Germany's population. The regular Wehrmacht gets first pick of recruits. The SS gets what's left, and what's left are Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans from Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia who may have German surnames but speak German as a second language. They stand in the Norwegian cold while SS Obergruppenführer Karl Hermann Frank delivers a speech about destiny, duty, and the supremacy of will over circumstance. Most of the men don't understand half the words. They're not here for ideology. They're here because saying no to the SS is not an option. The division structure looks impressive on organizational charts drawn in Berlin. 2 mountain infantry regiments, the 6th and 7th Gebirgsjäger regiments, supported by artillery, reconnaissance, anti-tank, and engineering battalions. Each regiment contains 3 battalions of approximately 800 men. On paper, it's a formidable force designed to fight in mountainous terrain. In reality, it's a bureaucratic fiction. 40% of the initial recruits are Volksdeutsche who have never seen serious combat. Another 20% are German nationals judged unfit for frontline service on the eastern or western fronts. Too old, too young, or recovered from injuries that left them less than combat ready. The remaining 40% are a mix. Genuine mountain warfare veterans transferred from other divisions, SS volunteers seeking advancement, and convicted criminals offered military service instead of prison. It is not an elite force. It is an experiment in whether ideological commitment can substitute for military competence. Training reveals problems immediately. Standard mountain warfare doctrine, developed in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps, assumes the existence of mountains. The Arctic has none. It's flat, frozen tundra occasionally interrupted by low hills that barely qualify as slopes. Equipment designed for alpine operations proves useless. The skis distributed to troops are 3 meters long, designed for controlled downhill skiing, not for crossing flat terrain where you need to push yourself forward constantly. Most recruits have never worn skis. Some have never seen snow deeper than a few centimeters. Instructors from Wehrmacht mountain divisions, men who fought in Norway's Narvik campaign, try to teach fundamentals in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht veterans look at the SS officers with barely concealed contempt. One Wehrmacht major writes to a colleague, "They've given me farmers and shopkeepers, told me to turn them into mountain troops, and allocated 6 weeks for training that requires 6 months. I am teaching dancing to men without legs." March 1941. A training exercise goes catastrophically wrong. 2nd Battalion of the 7th Regiment conducts a nighttime navigation drill across 15 kilometers of frozen tundra. Objective: reach checkpoint Bravo before dawn, simulating a surprise attack on enemy positions. Reality: 3 squads get lost in a whiteout snowstorm. Temperatures drop to minus 32 degrees Celsius. 2 men freeze to death. 14 others suffer severe frostbite requiring amputation of extremities. The exercise is called off after 9 hours when rescue teams find survivors huddled around a fire, made from their own wooden rifle stocks. The after-action report is damning. inadequate cold weather gear, insufficient map training, poor leadership at squad level, and fundamental unpreparedness for Arctic conditions. The report is filed and ignored, nor it has a deployment date. Ready or not, they're going north. April brings new problems. Ethnic tensions within the division. SS ideology preaches German superiority and racial hierarchy, but practical reality creates uncomfortable contradictions. Romanian Volksdeutsche and Third Company get into a brawl with German nationals from Bavaria. The argument starts over food portions and escalates into accusations about real Germans versus imported Germans. Company commanders punish everyone equally, but the underlying problem remains. You cannot build unit cohesion when half the men feel like second-class soldiers, and the other half resent serving alongside inferiors. Wehrmacht liaison officers report these tensions to their superiors. One report notes, SS Nord contains the ingredients for a competent division, experienced NCOs, adequate equipment, reasonable training, but ideology acts as a poison, preventing chemistry from working. They will fight, but whether they'll fight effectively is an open question. May 1941. Final preparations begin. Equipment manifests reveal the magnitude of bureaucratic incompetence. Winter coats are shipped to Mediterranean staging areas by mistake and will not arrive in Norway until August. Summer uniforms designated for Greece are en route to Arctic Finland. Boots designed for mountain climbing, stiff leather with steel nails for gripping ice, are distributed to men who will march across flat tundra, where the nails conduct cold directly into feet. Ski units receive inadequate wax for their equipment. The skis will stick to snow instead of gliding. Artillery battalions discover their gun oil freezes solid below -20 degrees. Weapons will need to be stored in heated tents and rapidly deployed when needed. Medical supplies include frostbite treatment ointments that freeze solid in their tubes, rendering them useless. These are not small oversights. They are systemic failures that predict disaster, and everyone knows it. Senior officers send cables to Berlin requesting delays, equipment corrections, additional training time. Every request is denied. The invasion of the Soviet Union is scheduled for late June. Nord will deploy when ordered. The relationship between SS officers and Wehrmacht advisors deteriorates into open hostility. SS officers, selected for ideological reliability rather than the combat experience, refuse advice from Wehrmacht veterans who've actually fought in Arctic conditions. When a Wehrmacht major suggests adapting Soviet tactics observed during the Winter War against Finland, dispersed formations, emphasis on mobility, acceptance of temporary setbacks, an SS captain interrupts, "We are not Soviets and we do not retreat." German spirit overcomes material disadvantage. The major does not argue. He simply writes another pessimistic report that disappears into headquarters bureaucracy. This philosophical divide, ideology versus pragmatism, will cost thousands of lives. But in May 1941, that cost exists only in potential. The men don't know yet. They're still young, still confident, still believing that willpower and discipline can conquer anything. June 1941. The division moves to forward staging areas along the Finnish-German border. For many soldiers, this is their first glimpse of the Arctic. Werner Schmidt, a 19-year-old from Munich, writes home, "I thought I understood cold. I was wrong. This is not cold like winter at home. This is something else. The wind cuts through your coat like you're naked. The sun never sets. So you can't tell what time it is. I slept for 3 hours this afternoon. At least I think it was afternoon. And woke up thinking it was morning because the sun was still up. Some of the men are getting sick. Not flu or cold, just sick. Tired. The medics don't know what to call it." Schmidt's letter is typical of hundreds sent home that month. The men are experiencing their first encounter with an environment that does not care about training, ideology, or national identity. The Arctic does not discriminate. It simply kills whoever is unprepared. And Nord is spectacularly unprepared. Final briefings occur in late June. Battalion commanders gather to receive operational orders. The plan is explained with confidence that will seem absurd in hindsight. Advance 200 kilometers northeast. engage and destroy Soviet defensive positions. Capture Murmansk within 6 weeks. The briefing officer uses a pointer to trace routes on a map that shows terrain in abstract, blue for water, green for vegetation, white for snow. What the map doesn't show is that green means impassable bog, that white means permafrost you cannot dig through, that the few roads marked on the map are unpaved tracks that turn to liquid mud under vehicle weight. Questions are discouraged. When one captain asks about winter supply lines, he's told the campaign will conclude before winter. When another asks about evacuation procedures for frostbite casualties in summer, he's told frostbite won't occur in summer. Both questions will be answered in blood. June 22, 1941, 400 hours. The offensive begins. 20,000 men cross from Finnish territory into Soviet-held tundra. They march in columns because there's nowhere else to march. Off the road is bog. They sing German marching songs because that's what soldiers do. They believe they're elite mountain troops beginning an important operation. In reality, they're about to discover that the SS's greatest experiment, whether ideology can replace competence, is about to fail catastrophically. The Arctic doesn't care about your beliefs. It doesn't respect your confidence. It simply tests you until you break. And Nord is about to be tested beyond anything they imagined. Within 3 months, half of these men will be dead, wounded, or evacuated for medical reasons. Within 3 years, the division will cease to exist. But right now, in the midnight sun of late June, they still have hope. That's the saddest part. They still believe. June 29th, 1941, 0600 hours. The artillery barrage begins. For 30 minutes, German guns pound Soviet positions 10 kilometers ahead. The sound echoes across the tundra, a rolling thunder that should terrify defenders and embolden attackers. It does neither. The Soviet 14th Army has spent 6 weeks preparing defenses in depth. Trenches blasted from bedrock with explosives. Machine gun positions concealed in the few depressions that exist in this flat landscape. Pre-registered artillery coordinates covering every approach route. They've fought the Finns in this exact terrain during the Winter War. They know what works. They sit in their bunkers, wait for the German barrage to end, and prepare to kill whoever comes next. When the barrage lifts, 6th SS Mountain Division Nord advances. They move in textbook formation, companies spread across a 2-kilometer front, platoons in staggered lines, NCOs keeping dress and spacing. It looks magnificent. It's also suicide. The first problem reveals itself within minutes. Tanks, Panzer III models assigned to support the infantry, advance 50 meters and sink to their hulls in what appeared to be solid ground. The tundra's surface layer, held together by shallow-rooted vegetation, cannot support 30-ton vehicles. Drivers gun their engines, trying to power through. Tracks spin uselessly. Within an hour, 6 tanks are completely immobilized, blocking the single road. Infantry must now advance without armor support across open ground, no cover, no concealment. Soviet observers watch from positions 3 kilometers away and calmly direct artillery fire. The first salvo lands in the middle of 2nd Company. 16 men die instantly. The survivors scatter, looking for any depression in the ground that might offer protection. They find none. The tundra is relentlessly, mercilessly flat. You can see forever, which means your enemies can see you forever. And what they can see, they can kill. First week of Operation Silver Fox produces a result that shocks German high command. 20 kilometers of advance in 6 days. This sounds respectable until you understand the plan called for 20 kilometers on the first day. Nord is moving at 1/6 expected speed. Casualties mount not from Soviet resistance, but from the terrain itself. Soldiers march 16 hours per day in full combat gear. The midnight sun never sets, destroying any sense of time. Men sleep when ordered to sleep, wake when ordered to wake, and exist in a perpetual twilight that makes days blend together. Water is everywhere, in bogs, in lakes, in streams, but almost none of it is potable without treatment. Dysentery spreads through companies. Field medics run out of anti-diarrheal medication within 3 days. Men become dehydrated despite being surrounded by water. It's absurd, it's deadly, and it's predictable. The Wehrmacht veterans who advised caution in training now watch their predictions come true. They say nothing, there's nothing to say. July 6, 1941. The Soviets counterattack. They don't use massed formations or frontal assaults. They use knowledge. Small groups of infantry, squads of 10 to 15 men, appear from ravines that German maps insist don't exist. They fire at German flanks and disappear before artillery can range them. Soviet ski troops cross terrain. Germans consider impassable, appearing behind forward positions and cutting supply lines. Suddenly, Nord's advance isn't just slow, it's contested. Every kilometer costs blood, and the Soviets keep coming. They're not defending anymore, they're attacking. German after-action reports struggle to explain how defenders have become attackers. The answer is simple. The Soviets know this land intimately, and knowledge is its own form of superiority. They know where to hide, where to attack, where to retreat. The Germans know only what their inadequate maps tell them. In a war where terrain determines everything, Nord is fighting blind. Field hospitals begin to overflow with casualties that aren't from combat. Trench foot in summer, hypothermia when temperatures drop at night. Exhaustion so severe that men collapse while marching. One medical officer writes in his report, "I have treated gunshot wounds in France, blast injuries in Poland, burns in Belgium. Nothing prepared me for this." These men are simply worn down by existing here. Their bodies are failing from the cumulative stress of environment. We evacuate 3 men for medical reasons for everyone wounded by enemy action. This is not war. This is entropy. The report reaches division headquarters, where it is read and filed. Berlin does not want negative reports. Berlin wants success. So, success is what the reports say, even as the offensive grinds to a halt. August 1941. Nord has advanced 30 kilometers in 2 months. They need another 170 kilometers to reach Murmansk. At current rates, they will arrive in September 1943, 2 years from now. Even the most ideologically committed SS officers understand this is failure. But acknowledging failure is impossible. SS ideology does not permit failure. Failure implies that German will is insufficient, that enemy resistance is effective, that material factors matter more than spirit. None of these can be admitted. So the offensive continues, not because anyone believes it will succeed, but because stopping would require admitting it cannot succeed. Men die for this face-saving exercise. Graves registration teams bury bodies in shallow pits because the permafrost prevents deep burial. The graves are marked with wooden crosses that will rot and disappear within 5 years. In a decade, no one will know where these men are buried. They will be truly forgotten, not just by history, but by the earth itself. September brings the first real cold. Temperatures drop to -5 degrees Celsius at night. Morning frost covers everything. The change is shocking, from summer's mosquito-infested heat to autumn's biting cold in less than 3 weeks. Most of Nord's soldiers are still wearing summer uniforms because winter gear is stuck in logistics. Men improvise, stuffing newspapers inside their tunics for insulation, wrapping their feet in burlap sacks, sharing the few winter coats that have arrived. Soviet troops, properly equipped for seasonal transition, watch these improvisations with professional interest. Some feel pity. Most feel satisfaction. The Germans are learning a lesson the Soviets learned decades ago. In the Arctic, equipment matters more than courage. You cannot will yourself warm. You cannot discipline yourself into survival. Either you have the gear or you die. It's that simple. By mid-September, the offensive is officially suspended. No one admits it's suspended. German press releases still describe operations to consolidate gains before final push. But on the ground, everyone knows. Nord will not reach Murmansk in 1941. Maybe not ever. Defensive positions are established, trenches are improved, and the division transitions from attacking force to occupying force. Soldiers who spent 3 months advancing 30 kilometers now face the prospect of spending winter defending those 30 kilometers. Morale collapses. Letters home become pessimistic. One soldier writes, "They told us the Russians were subhuman, incapable of real resistance. But the Russians have warm coats and we don't. They have food and we're hungry. They know where they are, and we're lost. Who is subhuman now? The letter is intercepted by SS mail sensors. The soldier is questioned about defeatist attitudes. He's eventually released. They need every man they can keep. But the letter is destroyed. Can't have evidence of doubt. Doubt is contagious. October 19th, 1941. First major snowfall. 30 centimeters in 12 hours. Vehicle movement becomes nearly impossible. Supply columns scheduled to deliver winter equipment, delayed since August, become stranded on roads that have ceased to exist under snow. Emergency deliveries are attempted by air. But Arctic weather grounds most flights. What arrives by parachute drop is often damaged or inadequate. One company receives 300 left boots and no right boots, a shipping error that would be comedy if it weren't deadly. Men try to wear 2 left boots. It doesn't work. Frostbite cases surge. The division's effective combat strength drops below 15,000 men. 5,000 soldiers have been evacuated for medical reasons in 4 months. None from combat wounds. All from the environment. The Arctic is winning, and winter hasn't even started yet. November brings polar night. Sunrise comes at 1100 hours. Sunset at 1300 hours. Soldiers live in near constant darkness. Vitamin D deficiency causes joint pain and depression. Men who were mentally sound in September become emotionally fragile in November. Fights break out over nothing. Discipline requires constant vigilance, and through it all, the line must be held. Soviet probing attacks come weekly, testing for weakness. Each attack must be repulsed. Each repulsion costs ammunition and casualties. There is no rest. There is no rotation. There is only the line, the cold, and the knowledge that Murmansk, the objective that justified all this suffering, sits 40 kilometers away and might as well be on the moon. Operation Silver Fox has failed. 20,000 men deployed to capture a city. They advance 30 kilometers. They will not advance further. The greatest offensive operation in Arctic warfare history has achieved nothing except the construction of a cemetery that stretches across 30 kilometers of frozen wasteland. The men know this. Their commanders know this. Eventually, even Berlin will know this. But right now, in November 1941, all they can do is survive until spring. If they survive at all. October 19th, 41. The offensive has stopped, but existence continues. Private Otto Bauer stands guard duty in a trench carved from bedrock. It's minus 15 degrees Celsius. His shift is 4 hours long. Protocol says 2 hours maximum at these temperatures, but there aren't enough men for proper rotation. 3 hours into his shift, he cannot feel his feet. 4 hours in, he's relieved by another soldier who looks at him and says, "Your nose is white." Frostbite. Bauer spends the next 6 weeks in a field hospital where a surgeon amputates the tip of his nose and 2 toes. He considers himself lucky. The man in the bed next to him lost both feet to gangrene. They're teenagers. Both of them learning that survival in the Arctic requires different skills than firing a rifle. You must know how to layer clothing, how to recognize hypothermia's early signs, how to sleep in temperatures that can kill you. The SS trains you to attack. It doesn't train you to simply exist. That knowledge must be earned through suffering. November brings a crisis that forces pragmatism onto ideological rigidity. Soldiers are dying from exposure at rates that exceed combat casualties 5 to 1. Standard German military equipment is inadequate for Arctic survival. The few supply convoys that make it through carry Wehrmacht-issue coats designed for Central European winters, not Arctic ones. These coats are warm enough for minus 10 degrees, useless below minus 20. Meanwhile, Finnish soldiers, Germany's allies, have reindeer fur parkas that work in minus 40 degrees. German troops begin bartering with Finnish units, cigarettes for warm clothing, captured Soviet watches for Finnish boots, some trade food rations, a dangerous choice, but frozen feet hurt more than an empty stomach. SS officers officially forbid fraternization with Finnish allies, then quietly look away when their men return from patrol wearing civilian fur hats and sealskin gloves. Ideology says Germans are superior and should not need help from racially inferior peoples. Reality says Germans are freezing to death and must accept help from anyone offering it. Reality wins. It always does. December 1941. A Wehrmacht medical officer named Klaus Fischer requisitions an aircraft engine from a crashed Junkers 52 transport. He mounts it in a dugout and runs it continuously, using the engine's waste heat to warm a space large enough for 30 men. Other units adopt this innovation. Soon every company has improvised heated shelters built around salvaged engines, stoves fashioned from fuel drums, anything that produces warmth. Survival rates improve dramatically. Men rotate through these heated spaces, 2 hours inside, 4 hours on duty, 2 hours back inside. It's not comfortable, but it keeps them alive. Fisher writes a report documenting this innovation and sends it up the chain of command, suggesting it be standardized across Arctic units. The report is filed and ignored. The German military does not learn from field improvisations. Doctrine is created in Berlin, not in trenches. If doctrine doesn't include engine-heated dugouts, then they don't officially exist, even as they save thousands of lives. The division's mission shifts from offensive operations to occupation. 280 kilometers of front line manned by 15,000 effective troops, one soldier every 18 meters. It's impossible. Standard military doctrine requires at least one soldier every 5 meters for adequate defense, with reserves for counterattacks. Nord has no reserves. Every man is on the line. Soviet intelligence understands this. They probe constantly, looking for gaps. Small raiding parties attack isolated positions at night. German casualties from these raids are steady. Not catastrophic, but relentless. 5 men lost here, 10 men lost there. Death by 1,000 cuts. And for every man killed, 3 more must extend their sectors to cover the gap. The line gets thinner. The men get more exhausted. The cycle continues. It's mathematics, and the mathematics favor the Soviets. Winter's psychological toll becomes visible in December. 18 hours of darkness per day destroys circadian rhythms. Men sleep when exhausted, which might be noon or midnight. Time ceases to have meaning. Without sunlight, vitamin D deficiency causes joint pain that antibiotics can't treat. Depression spreads through units like disease. Medical officers notice soldiers staring at nothing, unable or unwilling to respond to questions. They call it Arctic exhaustion and treat it with rest and warm food. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The worst cases are evacuated south, declared unfit for service, and quietly discharged. These men never appear in official casualty statistics. They're not wounded. They're not dead. They're just broken, and breaking in ways that 1941 military medicine doesn't understand or acknowledge. The relationship between Nord and Finnish forces becomes complicated by proximity and pragmatism. Finnish soldiers serve alongside German units, but under Finnish command. They're allies, not subordinates. This creates friction. Finnish officers watch Germans struggle with conditions Finns consider normal. Some Finnish troops help Germans learn Arctic survival, how to construct proper snow shelters, how to identify safe ice for crossing frozen rivers, which berries are edible, which will kill you. Other Finns maintain cold distance. Finland entered this war reluctantly, seeking to reclaim territory lost to the Soviet Union in the Winter War. They never wanted to conquer Murmansk or participate in Germany's ideological crusade. They want their land back, nothing more. This limited objective creates trust issues. German officers worry that Finns will negotiate separate peace with Soviets. Finns worry that Germans will drag them into battles they don't want to fight. Both sides are correct to worry. By 1944, these worries will materialize in catastrophic fashion. But in late 1941, they're still allies of necessity, teaching each other how to survive. Partisan warfare begins in earnest during winter months. Soviet ski troops operate behind German lines, targeting supply convoys and isolated outposts. These aren't regular army units. They're NKVD border guards and local volunteers who know every ravine and frozen lake. They appear, attack, and vanish before German forces can respond. Casualties from partisan raids remain low, maybe 20 German dead per month across the entire division. But psychological impact is enormous. Soldiers on guard duty scan white landscape, knowing enemies could be 300 meters away and invisible in snow camouflage. paranoia becomes rational. Every shadow might be a Soviet ski patrol. Every sound might be an approaching attack. Sleep becomes difficult, even when you have opportunity. Combat requires moments of terror punctuated by routine. Partisan warfare creates constant low-level terror that never stops. It wears men down in ways that pitched battles don't. SS security doctrine meets Arctic reality with predictable brutality. When partisans attack from villages, SS security units burn the villages. Suspected partisan supporters, defined loosely as any civilian near partisan activity, are arrested, interrogated, sometimes executed. This is standard SS procedure in occupied territories, from Poland to Ukraine to France. But Arctic Norway is different. The population is sparse, friendly, Finland is nearby, and every burned village creates 10 new partisan recruits. A Finnish liaison officer, Major Pekka Virtanen, attends a meeting where SS officers discuss anti-partisan operations. When Germans propose burning 3 Norwegian villages suspected of harboring Soviet scouts, Virtanen interrupts. Those are Norwegian civilians. Norway is Germany's ally. You burn Allied civilians? The SS captain replies, "We burn enemy collaborators." Virtanen leaves the meeting and files a report with Finnish High Command, expressing concern about German methods. The report changes nothing. The villages burn, and Virtanen begins to question whether Finland should remain allied with Germany. He's not alone. By late 1941, Finnish officers are quietly discussing exit strategies from a war they no longer believe in. Logistics becomes the dominant challenge. Nord requires approximately 100 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment. The single road connecting the front to supply depots 200 kilometers south is unpaved, snowbound, and constantly attacked by partisans. Supply convoys take 4 days to make the round trip when they arrive at all. Half the convoys are turned back by weather or ambush. This creates cascading shortages. Ammunition rationing limits how much fire support can be provided during Soviet attacks. Fuel rationing means vehicles sit immobile. They become pillboxes instead of transport. Food rationing reduces daily calories below minimum requirements for men working in sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers lose weight. Physical performance declines. Immune systems weaken. Disease spreads. And the spiral continues, each shortage feeding into the next, creating a division that's slowly starving, even though supply trains run regularly. The problem isn't lack of supplies, it's lack of ability to deliver those supplies across Arctic wasteland in winter. Geography defeats logistics, logistics defeats strategy, and soldiers pay the price. By year's end, December the 31st, 1941, 6th SS Mountain Division Nord exists in stalemate. They hold a 280-kilometer front with inadequate manpower. They cannot advance, they cannot retreat. They can only hold and hope to survive until spring. 1,700 men have died since June, some from combat, most from environment. 4,000 more have been evacuated for medical reasons. Replacement troops arrive monthly. Green recruits from Germany, who've received 6 weeks of training and no Arctic acclimatization. These replacements are thrown into frontline positions immediately because there's no alternative. They learn or they die. Most learn, some die learning, and the veterans who have survived since June look at these new arrivals with pity and contempt. Pity because the new men have no idea what awaits them. Contempt because the veterans remember when they were equally naive 6 months ago. The Arctic teaches harshly. The Arctic teaches constantly. And the greatest lesson, the one that takes longest to learn, is that this place does not care about you, your ideology, your nation, or your cause. It simply tests whether you can endure. Most cannot. Those who can will never be the same. December 21st, 1941, 1100 hours. The sun rises briefly above the horizon, casting long shadows across snow. By 1300 hours, 2 hours later, it sets again. This is polar night. 60 days where the sun never fully rises, where twilight at midday is as bright as it gets. For soldiers stationed at latitude 69 degrees north, This means living in near total darkness for 2 months. Human neurology evolved for day-night cycles. Remove that cycle, and the brain malfunctions. Sleep disorders emerge within days. Circadian disruption causes irritability, poor judgment, delayed reaction times. Vitamin D deficiency, the sun produces it, darkness doesn't, weakens bones and causes depression. This isn't psychological weakness. This is neurological collapse caused by environmental factors beyond human control. But in 1941, military medicine doesn't understand this. They see soldiers who cannot function and label them cowards. The punishment for cowardice is execution. Men are shot for having brains that cannot adapt to conditions no human brain evolved to handle. Soviet psychological operations exploit Nord's vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Loudspeakers positioned 500 meters from German lines broadcast German language programs nightly. Christmas carols in December, letters purportedly from German soldiers' wives describing affairs with other men. News reports, some true, some fabricated, about German defeats on other fronts. The content is less important than the delivery. Soviet broadcasts play during guard shifts when men are alone, exhausted, and most vulnerable to suggestion. One soldier, Gefreiter Hans Weber, describes the experience in a letter home. The darkness makes you doubt everything. You hear voices in German telling you the war is lost, your wife has left you, and you're dying for nothing. Logically, you know it's enemy propaganda. But at 3 in the morning, after 40 hours without sleep, logic doesn't work. You start believing the voice. Not because it's convincing, but because your mind cannot resist anymore. I'm afraid of what I might believe if this continues. Psychiatric casualties surge in January 1942. Field hospitals establish a separate ward for nervous exhaustion, military euphemism for mental breakdown. Symptoms vary. Soldiers who cannot stop shaking despite warm temperatures. Men who stare at walls and don't respond to questions. Troops who sob uncontrollably for hours. One medical officer, Captain Wilhelm Strauss, documents these cases in clinical detail. His reports describe symptoms that modern psychiatry would recognize as sensory deprivation, psychosis, combined with severe PTSD. Strauss's treatment options are limited: rest, warm food, and removal from frontline duty. Some men recover, others don't. Strauss recommends extended psychiatric leave for severe cases. His recommendations are rejected by Division Command. The reasoning is simple. If we evacuate every soldier with nervous problems, we'll have no division left. So the broken men are patched together with inadequate care and sent back to the line. Most break again. The cycle continues. February 1942. A company commander, Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Koch, discovers 3 of his men have committed suicide over a single weekend. All 3 were veteran soldiers, survivors of the summer offensive, men who demonstrated courage under fire. Koch investigates. He learns all 3 exhibited similar symptoms before death: inability to sleep despite exhaustion, paranoid beliefs about being watched, extreme reactions to minor stressors. Koch writes a report suggesting these deaths represent psychiatric casualties caused by environmental factors, not moral failure. His report is reviewed by division medical staff, who agree with his assessment, then reviewed by SS security officers, who do not. The security officers rule the suicides were cases of cowardice unrelated to environmental stress. Their ruling is political, not medical. Admitting that the Arctic causes psychiatric casualties would require admitting that willpower cannot overcome material conditions. SS ideology cannot accept this. Therefore, these men were cowards. End of discussion. Their deaths are recorded as killed in action to avoid embarrassing questions from Berlin. Soviet and German soldiers sometimes encounter each other during this period under circumstances that reveal shared humanity despite ideological divides. In late January, a German patrol becomes lost during a whiteout blizzard. 3 men separate from their unit, wander for 8 hours, and collapse from exhaustion in sight of Soviet positions. Soviet troops retrieve the Germans, unconscious and near death from hypothermia, and place them in a bunker with a fire. When the Germans wake, a Soviet lieutenant gives them hot tea and bread. Through a combination of gestures and broken German, the Soviet explains, "War tomorrow, tonight, everyone is cold." The Germans are held for 2 days until weather clears, then released back to German lines under informal truce. Both sides understand that the environment is a greater enemy than each other. Stories like this circulate through both armies, never officially acknowledged, occasionally punished when discovered, but persistent nonetheless. Humanity survives even here, even now, in the darkest period of the darkest winter of the 20th century. Attempted mutiny occurs on January 23rd. 30 soldiers from 4th Company decide they've had enough. They abandon their positions and march south toward supply depots, intending to find transport back to Norway and then Germany. Their plan is naive. They have no authorization, no transport, and no realistic chance of success. But desperation erases logic. They make it 15 kilometers before military police intercept them. All 30 are arrested. Courts-martial proceed rapidly. 5 men, identified as ringleaders, are executed by firing squad as examples. The remaining 25 receive prison sentences, later commuted because the division cannot afford to lose 25 men to imprisonment when manpower is critically short. They're sent back to their units in disgrace. Their attempted mutiny is classified and never officially recorded. If Berlin learned that 30 SS soldiers attempted to desert en masse due to environmental conditions, questions would be asked that commanders cannot answer. Better to pretend it never happened. Better to bury the story, along with the 5 executed men. March brings the first hint of returning daylight. Sunrise comes earlier, sunset comes later. By month's end, Nord experiences 8 hours of daylight daily. The psychological relief is immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who were barely functional in February become alert and engaged in March. Vitamin D levels normalize, sleep patterns improve, depression lifts. Medical officers document a 50% reduction in psychiatric casualties between February and March, directly correlated with increased daylight. The lesson is clear. Polar night causes psychological damage that polar day reverses. This should inform future Arctic operations. It doesn't. Lessons learned in Nord's experience are never systematized into doctrine because doing so would require admitting the experience was a failure. Better to pretend Nord's first winter was a difficult but manageable challenge overcome by superior German discipline. The truth, that men suffered neurological damage from environmental factors and recovered only when those factors changed, cannot be officially acknowledged. Medical statistics from Nord's first winter tell a grim story. 6,000 men evacuated for frostbite and related cold injuries, 4,000 evacuated for disease, mostly dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, 2,000 evacuated for nervous exhaustion. That's 12,000 medical evacuations in 5 months, 60% of the division's initial strength, and most will never return to frontline service. Combat casualties during the same period, 800 killed, 1,200 wounded. The environment is killing and disabling men at 15 times the rate of Soviet bullets. This ratio should prompt fundamental reevaluation of Nord's mission and deployment. Instead, replacement troops are sent north to fill gaps. No change in equipment, tactics, or strategy. Just more men fed into the machine that grinds them down and spits them out. This is not warfare. This is administrative murder disguised as military necessity. April 1942. Spring arrives with shocking suddenness. Temperatures rise above freezing, snow melts. The tundra transforms from frozen wasteland to impassable swamp. New problems emerge. Trenches flood. Vehicles sink. Mosquitoes return in numbers that defy imagination. Clouds so thick that men inhale them. But compared to winter, these problems seem manageable. Men who survived polar night look at warming temperatures and pestilential insects with something approaching gratitude. They're alive. They're still here. The winter that should have killed them didn't. There's pride in this. Twisted pride, maybe, but real nonetheless. They've endured what civilian Germans cannot imagine. They've learned skills no training manual teaches. They've become Arctic veterans. A designation that carries weight in conversations with rear echelon troops. But they've also changed in ways they don't fully understand yet. The darkness left marks on their minds. The cold damaged their bodies. and the isolation corroded their faith in the mission, the ideology, the entire war. They don't talk about this. They barely think about it consciously. But deep down, everyone who survived that first winter knows the truth. They're not fighting for victory anymore. They're fighting to survive until they can go home. That's all. That's everything. Spring 1942, May 14th, 0300 hours. Convoy. 17 leaves Kirkenes heading northeast, carrying 2 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and mail from home. 40 German soldiers escort it. The convoy never arrives at its destination. Finnish scouts find it 30 hours later. 7 trucks burned, 40 bodies scattered across half a kilometer. Everything of value stripped. Soviet partisans. They appeared from nowhere, killed everyone in 15 minutes, and vanished into terrain they know intimately. This isn't warfare. Warfare has rules, fronts, identifiable enemies. This is something else. Shadow combat, where the enemy is invisible until he's killing you, where victory is measured not in territory taken, but in convoys destroyed and soldiers ambushed. Nord's mission is evolving from conventional warfare to counterinsurgency. The problem is that Nord trained for mountain combat, not partisan hunting. They're learning a new kind of war on terrain that punishes every mistake with death. The arithmetic of partisan warfare favors the insurgents overwhelmingly. Nord holds 280 kilometers of front with 15,000 men. Behind that front lies another 300 kilometers of supposedly secure territory filled with Norwegian villages, Finnish settlements, and scattered Soviet stragglers who never retreated in 1941. From this vast area, Soviet intelligence recruits, trains, and supports partisan units numbering approximately 2,000 fighters. These partisans don't hold territory. They strike and disappear. Every convoy requires escort. Every supply depot needs guards. Every communication line must be patrolled. Nord lacks enough men for these tasks while simultaneously manning frontline positions. Security operations consume 60% of division resources by mid-1942. 6 out of every 10 soldiers are now dedicated to protecting supply lines rather than fighting the Red Army. This is the partisan strategic victory, forcing a conventional army to spread itself impossibly thin, defending everything from threats that could be anywhere. June brings escalation. After Convoy 17's destruction, Division Command issues new anti-partisan directives. Any village within 10 kilometers of partisan activity is subject to search and potential reprisal. Suspected partisan supporters face interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. Civilian populations must provide information about partisan movements or face collective punishment. These orders transform occupation from tense coexistence to active repression. SS security detachments, the men who join Nord for ideological reasons, who believe in racial hierarchy and the necessity of force, eagerly implement these directives. Norwegian civilians who'd tolerated German occupation now experience its full weight. Houses searched without warning, men arrested on suspicion, villages burned for hosting partisans, or for being near where partisans attacked. This isn't military necessity. This is terror designed to create compliance through fear. The Kirkenes incident occurs on June 28, 1942. A partisan ambush kills 7 German soldiers near the town of Kirkenes in occupied Norwegian territory. Local SS security forces respond by arresting 32 Norwegian civilians from nearby villages. All are questioned. None provide information, whether because they don't know anything or refuse to say is irrelevant. 19 of the 32 are executed on June 30th in a mass shooting conducted in public view as a deterrent. Norwegian underground networks document the incident in detail, names of the executed, testimonies from witnesses, photographs of the bodies. This documentation will later form evidence at war crimes trials. But in June 1942, there are no trials. There's only power and violence. The Norwegian government in exile, operating from London, protests to Berlin through intermediaries. Berlin ignores the protest. The Norwegian resistance begins actively supporting Soviet partisans. German reprisals have achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of intimidating civilians into compliance, they've radicalized a population that was previously neutral. Comparison with other SS divisions reveals Nord's anti-partisan record as surprisingly less brutal than units operating in occupied Soviet territory, Belarus, and Ukraine. Das Reich Division massacres entire villages routinely. Totenkopf Division operates death squads as official policy. Nord's atrocities are measured in dozens of executions, not thousands. Why? The most likely explanation is pragmatic rather than moral. Norway is officially Allied territory. Finland is a co-belligerent with some international standing, and excessive brutality risks alienating the only allies Germany has in the Arctic. Additionally, many Nord officers are Wehrmacht mountain warfare veterans, temporarily assigned to SS command. These men understand counterinsurgency requires winning civilian cooperation, not just killing insurgents. They moderate the worst impulses of ideologically driven SS officers. This moderation is relative. 19 executions is still mass murder. But it creates a division that's brutal without being genocidal. Whether this distinction matters to Norwegian families who lost members is questionable. Dead is dead, regardless of comparative statistics. Finnish reactions to German anti-partisan methods strain the alliance. Finnish liaison officers witness German reprisals and file reports expressing concern. Major Pekka Virtanen, who's observed Nord since 1941, writes in July 1942, "The Germans treat local populations as enemies rather than potential allies. They create partisans faster than they kill them. This approach may work in Poland or Russia, where populations are already hostile. But Norway was friendly until German security forces made it otherwise. Our alliance with Germany becomes harder to justify when we watch them burn Norwegian villages for partisan attacks that originated from Soviet infiltrators, not local resistance." Virtanen's reports reach Finnish high command, where they contribute to growing disillusionment with the German partnership. By late 1942, Finnish politicians begin quiet inquiries about negotiating separate peace with the Soviet Union. These inquiries go nowhere in 1942. Stalin demands unconditional surrender and territorial concessions Finland won't accept, but they demonstrate that Germany's heavy-handed tactics are undermining the coalition. Soviet partisan tactics evolve throughout 1942. Early raids were opportunistic, small groups attacking isolated targets. By summer, Soviet intelligence organizes larger operations coordinated across multiple locations. On July 15th, 3 separate convoys are ambushed simultaneously across a 100-kilometer front. German forces cannot respond to all 3 attacks. 2 convoys are destroyed completely. The third fights through with heavy casualties. Post-attack analysis reveals the raids were coordinated by radio communication between partisan groups. Evidence of sophisticated command structure. Soviet partisans are no longer scattered insurgents. They are organized military units operating unconventionally. This realization forces Nord to dedicate even more resources to rear security. Frontline strength continues declining as men are pulled back for convoy escort, checkpoint duty, and anti-partisan patrols. The psychological impact of partisan warfare differs fundamentally from conventional combat. In pitched battles, fear is intense but bounded in time and space. You fight, you survive, or don't, and then it's over. Partisan warfare creates persistent low-grade fear that never stops. Every Norwegian civilian might be a partisan informer. Every forest might conceal an ambush. Every quiet night might precede a dawn raid. This constant vigilance exhausts men psychologically in ways that conventional combat doesn't. Soldiers become paranoid, aggressive, prone to seeing threats where none exist. Trigger discipline erodes. In August, nervous sentries killed 2 Finnish soldiers approaching German checkpoints without proper recognition signals. Both shootings are ruled accidental, but they indicate deteriorating judgment under stress. The division's medical officers document increased psychological casualties, not dramatic breakdowns like Polar Night caused, but erosion of emotional stability that manifests as rage, paranoia, and poor decision-making. By September 1942, Nord has settled into a pattern that will persist until 1944. The front line is static. Neither side attacks seriously. The The real war happens behind the lines. Partisans attacking convoys, Germans retaliating against villages, Finnish allies growing increasingly uncomfortable with methods they observe. Casualty statistics reflect this evolution. In June 1941, 90% of casualties came from combat operations. By September 1942, 70% come from partisan warfare, accidents, and environmental factors. The division is bleeding out slowly, not from enemy armies, but from 1,000 small cuts inflicted by an enemy they cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot defeat. Every soldier knows this. They know they're fighting a war they cannot win, using methods that create more enemies than they kill. But orders come from Berlin, where generals study maps and see frontier lines that must be held. Berlin doesn't see the exhausted men, the burned villages, the partisan networks growing stronger every month. Berlin sees objectives and resources and issues orders, and soldiers in the Arctic die because of those orders, slowly, pointlessly, for gains that evaporate like morning fog under sunlight. August 1942. A British convoy designated PQ-18 fights through Arctic waters toward Murmansk. 13 merchant ships sink to German submarine and air attacks. 27 ships survive and dock at Murmansk's port. Over the next 3 weeks, Soviet stevedores unload 200 tanks, 120 aircraft, 3,000 vehicles, and 40,000 tons of food. These supplies will reach Soviet armies defending Stalingrad within 40 days. German generals 800 kilometers south, watching their assault on Stalingrad stall against unexpectedly strong resistance, don't realize that part of that resistance arrived through a port that sits 40 kilometers from German lines in the Arctic. This is the strategic reality that makes Nord's failure catastrophic. Murmansk remains operational, Allied supplies flow, and the Soviet Union survives battles it should have lost. The frozen hell where 20,000 German soldiers suffer matters more than anyone in Berlin wants to admit. The numbers tell a story the doctrine cannot explain. Between January 1942 and December 1943, Allied convoys deliver approximately 4.5 million tons of supplies through Murmansk, 22% of all Allied aid to the Soviet Union during this period. This includes 5,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft, 15,000 vehicles, and enough food to feed 2 million soldiers for a year. Every tank that arrives in Murmansk is a tank that doesn't need to be produced by Soviet factories. Every aircraft represents industrial capacity freed for other purposes. Lend-Lease doesn't just supplement Soviet production, it fundamentally alters the strategic balance. And all of it flows through a port that German forces can see from their positions but cannot reach. Nord sits 40 kilometers from Murmansk for 3 years. In those 3 years, Allied aid delivered through Murmansk exceeds total German tank production for 1943. This is strategic failure on a scale that dwarfs tactical defeats. Churchill understands what's at stake, even if Hitler doesn't. In a memo to British War Cabinet dated September 1942, Churchill writes, "The defense of the northern route is paramount. If Murmansk falls, Russia's capacity to resist collapses within 6 months. The Germans are 40 kilometers away. 40, not 400. 40. Every day that port remains open is a strategic victory equal to winning a major battle. British and American planners coordinate convoy schedules around ice conditions and German naval deployments. The convoys suffer horrific losses. PQ-17 loses 24 of 35 ships in July 1942, but they continue because there's no alternative. Murmansk must stay supplied, and Murmansk stays supplied because Nord cannot advance 40 kilometers across Arctic tundra to close it. German Naval Command recognizes the problem, even if Army commanders don't. Admiral Erich Raeder writes to Hitler in October 1942, arguing that submarines and aircraft sink Allied ships, but cannot stop the convoys. Only ground forces capturing Murmansk can permanently close the route. Raeder requests that Army Group North prioritize taking Murmansk above all other objectives. Hitler responds by demanding Nord launch a new offensive in spring 1943. Raeder's analysis is sound. Naval interdiction sinks individual ships, but doesn't stop the flow. But Hitler's solution, ordering another ground offensive, ignores why the previous offensive failed. The terrain hasn't changed. Soviet defenses have strengthened. Nord's combat effectiveness has declined. Ordering another attack won't produce different results. But Hitler doesn't accept this logic. Failure must mean insufficient will, not impossible objectives. So, he orders another offensive, gambling more lives on a strategy that already failed. Soviet strategic planning treats Murmansk as absolutely critical. Stalin personally reviews defensive deployments in the Arctic monthly, more frequently than for any other sector except Moscow and Leningrad. The 14th Army defending Murmansk receives priority for equipment and reinforcements throughout 1942 and 43. Soviet commanders understand that every day Murmansk remains open, Germany's chances of winning the war decrease. They don't need to attack. They just need to hold. And holding a defensive line against an understrength, poorly supplied, environmentally exhausted German division is achievable. Soviet defensive doctrine in the Arctic is simple. Fortify positions until they are impregnable, maintain overwhelming firepower, and let the Germans exhaust themselves attacking. It works. By late 1942, Soviet positions around Murmansk are more heavily fortified than positions defending Moscow. Finnish reluctance becomes a strategic factor that German planners ignore at their peril. Finland entered the war to reclaim territory lost in the Winter War, the Karelian Isthmus and areas around Lake Ladoga. They achieved this goal by December 1941. Finnish military leadership has no interest in advancing beyond pre-Winter War borders to capture Soviet territory that was never Finnish. When German commanders request Finnish assistance in attacking Murmansk, Finnish Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim refuses. His reasoning is practical. Capturing Murmansk serves German interests, not Finnish ones. Moreover, attacking deeper into Soviet territory risks turning a limited war into total war. Finland cannot win total war against the USSR. Therefore, Finland will defend what it reclaimed, but will not participate in German offensives. This decision means Nord must attack with only German forces, roughly 15,000 combat-effective troops against Soviet defenses manned by 50,000 soldiers. The arithmetic guarantees failure. Comparison between supply values reveals absurdity at the heart of German strategy. In 1943, Germany produces approximately 5,700 tanks total. In that same year, Allied convoys through Murmansk deliver approximately 3,000 tanks to the Soviet Union, plus tanks delivered through Persian Gulf and Pacific routes bring the total to nearly 7,000. The Soviet Union is receiving more tanks from allies than Germany can produce domestically. Additionally, Soviet factories produce their own tanks. In 1943, combined Soviet domestic production and Allied imports exceed German production by roughly 4-1. This ratio means the Red Army can afford to lose tanks at higher rates than Germans and still maintain numerical superiority. Every battle becomes a war of attrition that Germany cannot win. And that attrition is enabled by convoys sailing to Murmansk, a port Nord was supposed to capture in 6 weeks back in June 1941. The strategic blindness of German high command becomes clear in retrospect, but was invisible to participants at the time. Hitler and his generals genuinely believed, that willpower and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. This belief was not irrational in 1939, when Germany's qualitative advantages in training and doctrine allowed smaller forces to defeat larger ones. But by 1943, the Allies have closed the quality gap while maintaining material superiority. German tactical skill no longer compensates for being outnumbered and outproduced. Yet, German strategy doesn't adapt. Instead, commanders double down on the belief that next time, the offensive will work. Next time, willpower will triumph. Next time, the Russians will break. They never do. And Murmansk never falls. American perspectives on the Murmansk route reveal how global strategy depends on local tactical situations. U.S. military planners in Washington view the Arctic convoys as essential for keeping the Soviet Union in the war. If the USSR collapses, Germany can redeploy millions of troops to defend Western Europe, making D-Day impossible or catastrophically expensive. Therefore, American merchant ships must sail through submarine-infested Arctic waters to deliver supplies to a communist dictatorship that many Americans distrust. The reasoning is coldly pragmatic. Better to supply Stalin now than fight Germany alone later. Convoy crews understand the stakes. Merchant marines on Murmansk suffer casualty rates comparable to frontline infantry. Approximately 1 in 4 ships sunk during worst periods. These men are civilians, not soldiers. They volunteer for hazardous duty knowing they might die in freezing water 3,000 kilometers from home so that a port 40 kilometers from German lines can remain open. They're heroes in a war history largely forgets because the Arctic theater doesn't feature in popular memory. By year's end 1942, the strategic situation is clear to anyone willing to see it. Murmansk will not fall. Allied supplies will continue flowing. The Soviet Union will not collapse. And Nord, the elite SS division sent to change this equation, has failed its only mission. But admitting failure requires accepting that German strategy was flawed, that Hitler's intuition was wrong, that the war cannot be won. No one in Berlin accepts this in 1942. So, Nord remains in the Arctic, holding a line they cannot advance beyond, and defending objectives that don't matter, while the port that does matter sits 40 kilometers away and operates with impunity. The men in the trenches understand this. They look northeast toward Murmansk, see nothing but empty tundra stretching to a horizon they'll never reach, and realize they're dying for a failure that high command refuses to acknowledge. That knowledge, the certainty that your suffering means nothing, corrodes morale more effectively than any Soviet propaganda could, and it explains why, when the collapse finally comes in 1944, it happens so quickly. The men stop believing the mission mattered. Once soldiers stop believing, defeat becomes inevitable. July 10th, 1943, 0400 hours. Pre-offensive briefing. Battalion and company commanders gather in a bunker 5 kilometers behind the front line. Maps cover the walls showing Soviet positions, attack routes, objectives. The briefing officer, an SS major who arrived from Berlin 6 weeks ago, explains the plan with confidence. Operation Platinum Fox will succeed where Silver Fox failed. The division has rested, received reinforcements, and learned from past mistakes. The attack will employ new tactics. Concentrated assault on narrow front, breakthrough followed by rapid exploitation. Murmansk captured within 3 weeks. Veterans in the room, men who survived 1941 and 42, listen with faces that reveal nothing. They've heard this before. They know how it ends. But orders are orders. At 0600 hours, July 12th, the attack begins. Within 72 hours, it will be over. The results will validate every pessimistic prediction the veterans made and ignored. The assault's first objective is Hill 2 67.5, an unremarkable rise that offers observation over 10 kilometers of tundra. Soviet forces have held it since 1941. They've spent 2 years fortifying, trenches carved from bedrock, bunkers with overhead cover-proof against artillery, interlocking fields of fire covering every approach, minefields, wire obstacles, pre-registered artillery coordinates. The hill is a fortress. German planners know this. Their solution is overwhelming firepower. 1 hour of preparatory bombardment using every artillery piece and mortar in the division. At 0600 hours, the barrage begins. For 60 minutes, German guns pound Soviet positions. Observers report the hilltop disappears in smoke and dust. Surely nothing can survive this. Surely the Soviets are dead or fleeing. The barrage lifts. German infantry advance. Soviet machine guns open fire immediately. The artillery destroyed nothing. The Soviets waited in bunkers, then returned to firing positions. The first wave, 200 men, takes 30% casualties before retreating. Second wave attacks 2 hours later after another artillery barrage. Different result, same outcome. Soviet defenses hold. By noon, Nord has committed 4 waves totaling 800 men against Hill 267.5. They have gained 50 meters of the hill's lower slope and lost 240 men, killed or wounded. Company commanders radio division headquarters requesting permission to disengage. Permission denied. The attack continues. 3rd day, 4th wave, 5th wave. The hill becomes a killing ground where German infantry advance into pre-sighted machine gun fire and die in the same positions their predecessors died. Soviet intercepted radio communications, decoded by German intelligence, reveal Soviet reactions. One Soviet commander transmits, "Enemy attacking same positions using same tactics. Request permission to cease fire and save ammunition. They're walking into death without our help." Black humor, but accurate. Nord is repeating 1941's mistakes with even worse results, because Soviet defenses have improved while German capabilities have declined. Casualty reports from the first week shock even the most pessimistic observers. 2,400 men killed, wounded, or missing. 1,200 meters of ground gained. The arithmetic is brutal, 2 lives per meter. At this rate, reaching Murmansk, still 160 kilometers away, would cost Nord 320,000 casualties. The division's current strength is approximately 12,000 combat effectives. Continuing the offensive requires killing the division 26 times over. These numbers should force operational pause and strategic reassessment. Instead, Division Command issues orders to continue attacking. The reasoning is ideological rather than military. Stopping admits failure, and SS troops do not fail. So, the attacks continue even after everyone knows they're pointless. Men die to save face for commanders who won't admit mistakes. Soviet tactical doctrine exploits German predictability with devastating effect. After 6 days of observation, Soviet commanders understand German attack patterns completely. Attacks come between 0-600 and 0-800 hours after artillery preparation. Infantry advance in company strength across predictable routes. German forces lack reserves for exploitation. Every man is committed to initial assault. Soviet response evolves into a formula. Weather the artillery in bunkers, return to positions, engage advancing infantry at medium range, 300 to 500 meters, where Soviet machine guns are effective and German rifles are not. Withdraw from forward positions if penetrated. Counterattack with reserves to retake lost ground. Repeat. This formula works because Germans cannot adapt. SS training emphasizes aggression and willpower, not tactical flexibility. When frontal assault fails, SS doctrine says, attack again with greater determination. It doesn't say try different tactics because different tactics suggest German methods are flawed. Ideology over competence kills thousands. Finnish observers watch the offensive with grim fascination. Major Virtanen, now promoted to liaison coordinator, files daily reports to Finnish High Command describing German operations. His July 18th report is particularly scathing. The Germans approach warfare as religious ritual rather than problem-solving. They attack because attacking demonstrates will and commitment, not because attacks achieve objectives. When attacks fail, they attack again to prove the first failure was anomaly, not pattern. This is not military incompetence. Incompetence implies trying to succeed and failing. This is ideological performance, where success matters less than demonstrating proper beliefs. I am watching men die for theology disguised as strategy. Virtanen's report contributes to Finnish leadership's growing conviction that Germany will lose the war. By mid-1943, Finnish politicians are secretly exploring exit strategies from the German alliance. Hill 2, 6-7. Point 5 changes hands 6 times in 8 days. Germans capture it on July the 14th after 3 days of continuous assault. Soviets counterattack that night and retake it. Germans attack again on July 15th and recapture it. Soviets counterattack on July 16th and retake it. This pattern continues. The hill itself has no intrinsic value. It's simply the nearest objective to German lines and therefore becomes the focal point for measuring progress. By July 19th, the hilltop is a lunar landscape, shell craters overlapping. vegetation destroyed, bodies from both sides lying in positions where they fell because neither side controls the ground long enough to recover them. German and Soviet dead lie within meters of each other, sometimes touching. In death, ideology doesn't matter. The hill doesn't care who holds it. It's just rock and dirt, contested by men who die without changing anything. July 20th, 1943. Division Command receives a message from Hitler's headquarters congratulating Nord on aggressive spirit and determined attacks. The message notes that troops are demonstrating proper National Socialist offensive ethos. It makes no mention of casualties, territorial gains, or strategic progress. The message is pure ideology. You're praised not for achieving objectives, but for attacking with correct attitude. Company commanders read this message to their troops. The reactions range from bitter laughter to silent rage. These men know 1,200 meters cost 2,400 casualties. They know Murmansk is still 160 kilometers away. They know the offensive has failed, and Hitler congratulates them for dying enthusiastically. One sergeant, a veteran of 1941, is overheard saying, "They've turned us into a suicide cult that wears uniforms." July 22, 1943. The offensive is officially suspended pending operational reassessment and reorganization. Unofficially, everyone understands it's over. Nord has gained 800 meters, less than a single kilometer, in 12 days at cost of 2,400 men. The casualty rate is 3 lives per meter gained, worse than Verdun in World War I, worse than Stalingrad, worse than any battle Nord has fought. Soviet casualties are estimated at 800, a 3-to-1 ratio favoring defenders. This ratio is the opposite of what attackers need. Military doctrine says attackers should inflict 3 casualties for everyone suffered to justify offensive operations. Nord is suffering 3 casualties for everyone inflicted. The offensive isn't just failing, it's a massacre. And the most damning fact, Soviet positions after the offensive are stronger than before it started because they captured German equipment and learned German tactics while losing proportionally fewer men. August brings official explanations for the offensive's failure. Hitler's headquarters issues a statement blaming insufficient aggressive spirit among certain units. This explanation is psychologically convenient. It attributes failure to moral weakness rather than strategic impossibility, but factually absurd. Nord's soldiers attacked repeatedly despite knowing they would die. They demonstrated more courage than any soldier should be asked to demonstrate. The failure wasn't insufficient aggression. It was insufficient everything else. Insufficient artillery to suppress defenders, insufficient armor to support infantry, insufficient air support to neutralize Soviet firepower, insufficient reserves to exploit breakthroughs, insufficient supplies to sustain operations, and most importantly, insufficient realism in planning. You cannot capture a heavily fortified position defended by numerically superior forces, using understrength depleted units attacking across terrain that favors defenders. This is not opinion, this is mathematics. But mathematics doesn't matter when ideology determines strategy. So, the official explanation blames soldiers for lacking proper National Socialist spirit, while the real culprit, strategic incompetence combined with ideological rigidity, remains unacknowledged. Veterans understand this. They understand they were sacrificed to prove a point that cannot be proven. And that understanding destroys whatever loyalty they felt toward leadership. The offensive failed militarily, but the real casualty is trust, and armies without trust don't function. Nord will discover this truth in 1944 when it matters most. August 28, 1943. SS Brigade Führer Matthias Klein-Heisterkamp, commander of 6th SS Mountain Division Nord since June, is relieved of command. The official reason, reassignment to other duties. The real reason appears in private Wehrmacht correspondence. Klein-Heisterkamp submitted after-action reports from Operation Platinum Fox that honestly described the offensive's failure and recommended against future attacks without substantial reinforcement and equipment upgrades. Honest reporting is career suicide in the SS. Klein-Heisterkamp is replaced by SS Brigadeführer Gustav Lombard, a committed National Socialist whose previous command experience consists primarily of rear area security operations in occupied Poland. Lombard's first address to division officers emphasizes will over material factors and the necessity of offensive spirit. Veterans listen without comment. They've heard this speech before. In 12 months, Lombard will also be relieved for insufficient results. He will be Nord's fourth commander in 3 years. The average tenure of a Nord division commander is 6 months. You cannot build effective military leadership with 6-month turnover. But effectiveness matters less than ideological reliability. And ideological reliability guarantees continued failure. The command structure reveals fundamental contradictions. Division commander positions are reserved for SS officers, men selected primarily for political loyalty and racial ideology rather than military competence. Staff positions, operations, logistics, intelligence, are often filled by Wehrmacht officers temporarily assigned to SS units. These Wehrmacht officers have professional military training and combat experience, but they lack authority to override SS commanders even when SS decisions are tactically insane. This creates a two-tier system where competent professionals provide advice that ideologically pure amateurs ignore. Major Friedrich Weber, Wehrmacht operations officer assigned to Nord in March 1943, describes the dynamic in a letter to a colleague. I brief the commander on tactical realities. He listens politely, then asks whether recommended actions demonstrate proper offensive spirit. When I explain that defensive operations are sometimes necessary, he suggests I may not understand National Socialist warfare principles. He then orders attacks that ignore every military principle I've ever learned. The attacks fail. He blames unit-level execution, never strategy. I write reports documenting why the attacks failed. The reports are filed and ignored. I am present to provide technical competence, but competence is subordinate to ideology. This cannot work. Casualty statistics for officers reveal the human cost of command dysfunction. Company-level officers, lieutenants and captains who lead platoons and companies, have casualty rates exceeding 60% between June 1941 and December 1943. These men die because they follow orders. The orders come from battalion and regimental commanders who rarely visit front lines and have no practical understanding of conditions their subordinates face. Those battalion commanders answer to division staff who are even more isolated from reality, and division staff answer to Hitler's headquarters, which issues directives based on map exercises that bear no resemblance to actual combat. This command structure guarantees that bad information flows up, bad decisions flow down, and the men in between die trying to execute impossible orders. It's a system designed to fail, and it fails with ruthless efficiency. Comparison with Wehrmacht mountain divisions operating in similar terrain reveals how much ideology costs in practical terms. The 6th Mountain Division, Wehrmacht, not SS, fights in the Caucasus Mountains from 1941 to 43. They face comparable environmental challenges, extreme terrain, supply difficulties, resourceful enemies. Their casualty rates per kilometer advanced are roughly half of Nord's. Their tactical flexibility, willingness to withdraw, defend, use unconventional tactics, allows them to conserve strength and pick battles they can win. Most importantly, their commanders are selected for competence and rotated when they fail, not for ideological purity and retained despite failure. Wehrmacht mountain units are not paragons of military virtue. They commit atrocities, they lose battles, they suffer from same systemic problems as the rest of the German military. But they function better than Nord because competence outranks ideology. Nord demonstrates the opposite. When ideology outranks competence, even elite troops become ineffective. After-action reports undergo systematic alteration before reaching Berlin. This process is documented in multiple sources, including post-war testimony and captured documents. Battalion commanders write reports describing tactical failures, environmental challenges, and resource shortages. These reports reach division staff, where SS officers edit them to emphasize temporary setbacks overcome by superior German determination, rather than the failures. The edited reports reach Army Group North headquarters, where they're further modified to stress continuing operations against stubborn but ultimately inferior resistance. Finally, summaries reach Hitler's headquarters containing almost no resemblance to original reports. Hitler receives fiction. Nord is fighting bravely against overwhelming odds and making steady progress. Reality: Nord is suffering catastrophic casualties, achieving nothing. This information disconnect explains why Hitler continues demanding offensives that everyone at operational level knows cannot succeed. He doesn't know they cannot succeed because the information he receives describes a different war than the one being fought. Finnish liaison officers provide the clearest external perspective on Nord's command problems. Because Finns are technically allies but operationally independent, they can observe German operations without being part of German chain of command. Major Virtanen's reports from 1943 describe patterns invisible to German participants. He notes that Nord's tactical doctrine hasn't evolved despite 2 years of failure. Attacks still follow predictable patterns. Defenses still emphasize holding ground rather than maximizing casualties. Adaptation to enemy tactics is minimal. Virtanen writes in September 1943, "The Germans learn nothing, because learning requires admitting previous approaches were wrong. Admission of wrong approaches contradicts ideological certainty that German methods are inherently superior. Therefore, Germans repeat failed tactics while expecting different results." Einstein defined this as insanity. I define it as ideology poisoning military judgment. The result is the same: preventable death on massive scale. Individual commanders who attempt innovation face systematic suppression. Hauptsturmführer Ernst Schmidt, commanding 2nd Battalion of 7th Regiment, develops new defensive tactics in fall 1943. Instead of holding every meter of ground, he establishes flexible defense in depth. Forward observers identify Soviet attacks. Main forces withdraw to prepared positions. Soviets advance into kill zones. German counterattacks retake forward positions. This approach reduces Schmidt's casualties by 40%, while inflicting higher losses on Soviets. He writes a report documenting these tactics and recommending division-wide adoption. The report reaches division staff, where it's reviewed by SS officers who reject it. Reason for rejection: withdrawal contradicts SS fighting spirit and suggests cowardice. Schmidt's tactics work, but working is less important than demonstrating proper ideology. He's ordered to resume standard defensive posture. His casualties increase immediately. He requests transfer to another unit. Request granted. They're happy to be rid of a troublemaker. Schmidt survives the war and testifies at post-war inquiries about Nord's command dysfunction. The psychological impact on subordinates watching this dysfunction is corrosive. Junior officers and NCOs see that competence is punished, ideology is rewarded, honest reporting ends careers, and survival requires telling superiors what they want to hear regardless of truth. This creates culture of systematic dishonesty. Reports inflate successes, minimize failures, attribute problems to subordinate execution rather than flawed strategy. Battalion commanders lie to regimental commanders. Regimental commanders lie to division staff. Division staff lie to Army Group North. Everyone knows everyone is lying, but truth-telling is career suicide, so the lies continue. This culture metastasizes throughout the division. By late 1943, Nord's official reports bear no resemblance to ground truth. Casualty figures are understated. Territorial gains are overstated. Problems are attributed to temporary factors rather than systemic issues. The division is drowning in compounding falsehoods, and everyone knows it, and no one can acknowledge it without destroying their career. This is how organizations fail, not through single catastrophic decisions, but through accumulated dishonesty that severs connection between reality and leadership's understanding of reality. Winter 1943-44 brings no improvement in command competence. If anything, dysfunction intensifies. Replacement officers arrive from Germany with no Arctic experience, no combat experience, and complete confidence in their ideological training. They issue orders based on doctrine developed for temperate European warfare, and watch those orders fail in Arctic conditions. Subordinates try explaining why orders cannot be executed as written. New officers interpret explanation as insubordination or defeatism. Discipline actions increase. Morale plummets. The few competent officers remaining either request transfer or simply stop arguing and execute orders they know will fail. A Wehrmacht liaison officer writes in December 1943, "I have stopped providing realistic assessments. When I warned that planned operations were impossible given current resources, I was accused of defeatism. Now, I simply acknowledge orders and watch them fail. This is moral cowardice on my part, but self-preservation wins over professional duty. I am complicit in preventable deaths because speaking truth ends my ability to prevent any deaths. The system has broken me as thoroughly as it has broken the men dying in trenches." By early 1944, Nord's command structure has devolved into a machine that converts competent soldiers into casualties through systematic mismanagement. The individual Germans, soldiers of Nord, are not cowards. Their junior officers are not incompetent. Their tactics are not primitive. The failure occurs at strategic and operational levels where ideology corrupts decision-making to the point that military effectiveness becomes impossible. This distinction matters. Post-war accounts often describe German military failures as inevitable results of Nazi evil, as though immorality automatically produces military incompetence. Reality is more disturbing. Nord fails, despite having reasonably competent soldiers, because command structure selected for ideological purity produces leaders incapable of adaptation, honest assessment, or learning from failure. The evil of Nazi ideology is moral and obvious, but the military consequences of that ideology, selecting leaders for beliefs rather than competence, are equally important and less discussed. Nord demonstrates what happens when armies prioritize ideology over effectiveness. They become ritual organizations that perform warfare as religious ceremony rather than solving military problems. And ceremonial warfare kills your soldiers while achieving nothing. Nord will discover this truth definitively in autumn 1944, when Soviet offensive shatters the division in days. But the seeds of that collapse are planted here, in the systematic command dysfunction that defines Nord's final years. October the 7th, 1944, 400 hours. Soviet artillery opens fire along a 30-kilometer front. 2,000 guns, field artillery, heavy mortars, rocket launchers pound German positions with intensity Nord has never experienced. The barrage is not random. Soviet intelligence has spent months mapping German defensive positions using aerial reconnaissance, partisan reports, and radio intercepts. Every German bunker, trench line, and supply depot is pre-registered. Shells land with precision, collapsing positions that took 3 years to build. For 90 minutes, the earth convulses, then silence. German survivors emerge from bunkers expecting to man defensive positions. Those positions no longer exist. Soviet infantry appears from the smoke, not scattered skirmishers, but organized waves supported by tanks. Within 6 hours, Soviet forces penetrate 15 kilometers into Nord's defensive system. This is the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive. It will continue for 19 days. When it ends, Nord will have ceased to exist as an effective military formation. The collapse will be so complete, so catastrophic, that post-war historians will struggle to explain how a division that held these positions for 3 years disintegrated in less than 3 weeks. The arithmetic of the offensive reveals why collapse was inevitable. Soviet forces for the offensive: 133,000 infantry, 600 tanks, 2,100 artillery pieces, 700 aircraft. German defensive forces: approximately 8,000 combat-effective troops from Nord, minimal armor support, inadequate artillery, negligible air cover. The ratio is 15-1 in Soviet favor. German defensive doctrine requires at least 3-1 numerical superiority for defenders to successfully repel attackers. Nord faces 5 times the disadvantage that doctrine says is survivable. The defensive line they've held since 1941 was designed for different war: mobile defense with reserves for counterattack, adequate artillery for fire support, air superiority for reconnaissance and interdiction. By October 1944, Nord has none of these. They have trenches, bunkers, and rifles. Against 2,000 Soviet guns and 600 tanks, these are inadequate. Military science does not reward courage when mathematical force ratios guarantee defeat. First 72 hours produce casualties that exceed previous 6 months combined. 4,500 German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing between October 7th and 10th. Entire battalions ceased to exist as organized units. 2nd Battalion, 6th Regiment, the unit that captured Hill 267.5 in 1943, is surrounded on October 8th and destroyed on October 9th. 370 men enter battle. 42 escape encirclement. The rest are killed or captured. Similar stories repeat across the division. Units that fought together for years dissolve in hours. Survivors form ad hoc groups, 20 men from 4 different companies, fighting together because their original units no longer exist. Chain of command disintegrates. Company commanders lead survivor groups containing men they've never met. Regimental headquarters lose contact with battalions. Division headquarters issues orders that never reach intended recipients because communication lines are cut and runners are killed before completing their missions. Soviet tactics demonstrate 2 years of preparation. This offensive is not improvised. Every aspect is planned. Artillery fires are synchronized with infantry advances. Tank columns exploit breakthroughs along pre-planned routes. Reserve formations are positioned to reinforce success rather than defend against German counterattacks, which never materialize because Nord has no reserves. Soviet commanders learned from fighting Germans since 1941. They learned that Germans are tactically competent but strategically inflexible, that German doctrine emphasizes holding ground rather than preserving forces, that German officers will sacrifice units defending worthless positions rather than withdrawing to defensible lines. Soviet offensive doctrine exploits these weaknesses. They break German lines, immediately exploit breakthrough, and don't stop to consolidate. Traditional military doctrine says attackers should pause after initial success to reorganize. Soviets don't pause. They maintain momentum, punching through 3 years of German defensive preparation in 72 hours of continuous advance. The retreat begins without orders. Individual companies and platoons, seeing defensive lines collapsing on their flanks, withdraw to prevent encirclement. This is tactically sound. Staying in position means death, but organizationally catastrophic. Without coordinated retreat, units become separated. Supply lines are lost. Heavy equipment is abandoned because there's no fuel and no trucks to tow it. By October 10th, Nord is conducting fighting retreat, the most difficult military operation requiring discipline, coordination, and leadership. Nord has none of these. The retreat becomes a rout. Soldiers walk west-southwest toward Norway, moving by night to avoid Soviet aircraft, hiding during day in whatever cover exists. They abandon wounded who cannot walk. They discard heavy weapons. They eat when they find food and starve when they don't. Official military discipline evaporates. Officers who try maintaining formation are ignored or told to leave. Everyone understands there's no division anymore. There's just survival. Finnish actions accelerate the collapse. On September 19, 1944, 3 weeks before Soviet offensive, Finland signs armistice with Soviet Union and agrees to expel German forces from Finnish territory. German units in Finland, including portions of Nord, must retreat through potentially hostile Finnish forces. Finnish troops, following armistice terms, attack German rearguards on October 15th. Lapland War begins. Former allies fight each other while Soviets pursue Germans from the east. Nord's soldiers face enemies from 2 directions. Finnish attacks are not enthusiastic. Many Finnish soldiers refuse orders to kill Germans they fought alongside for 3 years. But they're real. Finns destroy bridges, block roads, and harass German columns. This transforms orderly retreat into desperation. German soldiers who spent 3 years defending Finnish territory now flee across that territory while former allies shoot at them. The bitter irony is not lost on anyone. Kirkenes, Norway, Nord's headquarters since June 1941, falls on October 25th. The city took 3 years to build into fortress. Permanent bunkers, supply depots, medical facilities, communication centers, all abandoned. Soviet forces enter Kirkenes, expecting pitched battle, and find empty buildings. German soldiers left so quickly they abandoned personal possessions. Letters from home, photographs, diaries. One Soviet soldier, interviewed decades later, describes finding a German military canteen where meals were still on tables, coffee still lukewarm. They left mid-meal, he recalled. That's when we understood they were running, not retreating. The symbolic significance is profound. Kirkenes represented Nord's permanent presence in the Arctic. Its fall represents Nord's permanent defeat. German propaganda had described Kirkenes as impregnable bastion. It fell in 6 hours without serious resistance. Military reality diverged from propaganda so completely that even Soviet troops were surprised. The distance Nord retreats in 2 weeks equals distance they advanced in 3 years. From October 7th to October 21st, German forces withdraw 250 kilometers southwest, further than they ever penetrated into Soviet territory. They are retreating through the same terrain they attacked across in 1941. Roadless tundra, impassable bogs, frozen streams. In 1941, they had supply lines, medical support, organized commands. In 1944, they have nothing. Men carry whatever they can scavenge. They sleep in abandoned buildings or dig shallow scrapes in frozen earth. Temperature drops to -20 Celsius. Many soldiers still wear summer uniforms because winter gear was abandoned during retreat. Frostbite casualties mount. Soldiers who survive 3 years of combat die during retreat from exposure and exhaustion. The Arctic, which protected Germans from Soviet attacks in 1941 through 43 by making a fence impossible, now kills Germans retreating through it. The land is neutral. It kills everyone equally. Germans just happen to be exposed to it now without protection. Medical evacuation becomes impossible. Field hospitals retreat ahead of combat units, taking whatever supplies can be moved. Wounded soldiers who cannot walk are left behind with medical orderlies who volunteer to stay. These volunteers know they'll be captured. Many write final letters home before staying with wounded. Post-war Soviet records indicate most German medical personnel who stayed with wounded were treated as prisoners of war and eventually repatriated, but individual soldiers rarely learn their fate. The decision to stay with wounded or retreat with mobile forces haunts survivors. Those who retreated saved themselves, but abandoned comrades. Those who stayed kept faith with wounded, but suffered years of Soviet captivity. There was no good choice. This is war's reality. Sometimes all options are terrible, and you choose least terrible and live with guilt regardless. October 25th, 1944. Nord crosses into German-occupied Norway. They've retreated from Soviet territory into what's technically friendly land. But friendly is relative. Norwegian resistance is active. Norwegian civilians remember German atrocities from years of occupation. And Norwegian underground networks provide intelligence to advancing Soviets. German soldiers find no welcome in Norway. Villages that provided supplies in 1941 now refuse. Roads Germans used for 3 years now have bridges destroyed. Resistance fighters snipe at retreating columns. Nord's retreat continues another 100 kilometers into Norway before Soviet pursuit halts at Norwegian-Finnish border. Stalin orders halt. He has no interest in attacking into Norway and provoking confrontation with Western allies who are advancing from France. Soviet strategic objectives achieved. Germans expelled from Arctic. Murmansk secured. German forces destroyed. Further advance is unnecessary. But halt comes too late for Nord. The division has disintegrated. Official combat strength on November 1st, 1,200 men. Original strength in June 1941, 20,000. 94% attrition in 3 years. The division exists on organizational charts but nowhere else. Nord is dead. October 28, 1944. Hitler issues Führerbefehl, Führer order, regarding retreat through Norway. Implement total scorched earth. Every building, every bridge, every structure capable of providing shelter must be destroyed. Rationale: deny Soviet forces infrastructure if they pursue into Norway. Reality: Soviets have already halted at Finnish-Norwegian border and show no intention of continuing west. Hitler's order will not slow Soviet advance because there is no Soviet advance. Instead, it will destroy Norwegian civilian infrastructure and turn retreat into war crime. Wehrmacht officers object, noting destruction violates international law regarding treatment of Allied territories. SS officers support the order enthusiastically. Ideology wins. Engineers receive explosive demolitions. Infantry receives accelerant compounds. And Finnmark Province, Norwegian territory where 6th SS Mountain Division Nord has operated since 1941, begins to burn. Forced evacuation of Norwegian civilians begins simultaneously with destruction. 50,000 Norwegians, entire population of Finnmark, receive orders to move south within 24 hours. Most comply because refusal means being left in a wasteland where every building is slated for demolition. Families load whatever they can carry onto wagons, trucks, or their backs. They walk south in October cold, joining columns of retreating German soldiers and displaced civilians, creating exodus from the Arctic. Norwegian resentment is palpable. For 3 years, Germans assured them occupation was protective, that German presence defended against Soviets, that cooperation benefited everyone. Now, those same Germans are burning Norwegian homes to implement strategy that serves no military purpose. The cognitive dissonance is extreme. One Norwegian woman, interviewed in 1986, recalled, "German soldier who'd been billeted in our house for 2 years told my father he'd received orders to burn it. He apologized, he was crying, then he burned it. That's when I understood that systems make men commit acts that individuals would refuse. The soldier was sorry, but sorrowful men still burn your house if ordered." Systematic destruction proceeds village by village. German engineers arrive with explosives and demolish stone buildings. Infantry with incendiary compounds burn wooden structures. Bridges are wired and detonated. Roads are cratered to delay potential Soviet armor advances. Telephone lines are cut. Power infrastructure is destroyed. Within 3 weeks, Finnmark province is reduced to ash and rubble. Post-war estimates document 10,700 buildings destroyed, 47,000 Norwegians displaced, and infrastructure damage requiring a decade to repair. The military utility is nil. Soviets never advance beyond Finnish border, but the human cost is catastrophic. Germany's Arctic occupation ends not with military defeat, but with vindictive destruction of territory they once claimed to protect. This is scorched earth as revenge, punishing Norwegian population for Germany's failure. Norwegian underground resistance escalates from intelligence gathering to active sabotage. Resistance fighters, watching Germans burn their country, abandon caution. They attack German supply columns, destroy vehicles, kill isolated soldiers. Some actions are strategic, targeting communications or command elements, but many are revenge. One resistance cell attacks a German engineering unit and executes 6 engineers who'd been demolishing Norwegian villages. Execution is filmed and shown to other resistance members as propaganda. German reprisals follow. 12 Norwegian civilians executed for suspected resistance support. Cycle of violence intensifies. By November, Norwegian resistance and German occupiers are in open warfare, despite Norway being officially Allied territory. Finnish resistance fighters, now also at war with Germans following September armistice, coordinate with Norwegians. Former allies or enemies. Geographic space that was rear area in 1941 becomes combat zone in 1944, and German soldiers retreating through this zone face hostility from populations they thought were neutral or friendly. Medical care during retreat is makeshift at best. Field hospitals evacuate west ahead of combat units, but capacity is overwhelmed. One medical officer, Captain Heinrich Kohler, documents conditions in a diary later recovered by Norwegian authorities. November 2nd entry. 1,200 wounded, facilities for 300. We perform triage not based on severity, but on likelihood of survival. Men who will probably die receive morphine and nothing else. Men who might survive receive surgery. We operate in unheated barns using supplies we salvage during retreat. Sterilization is primitive. Infection rates are catastrophic. We save perhaps 1 in 3 wounded who reach us. The rest die from injuries, infection, or complications we lack equipment to treat. This is not medicine. This is battlefield butchery conducted by doctors who've forgotten how to practice actual health care. I trained for 6 years to become surgeon. I've spent 4 years learning to be executioner of men I cannot save. German soldiers question orders with unprecedented frequency during retreat. In established defensive positions, questioning orders was unthinkable. Discipline and chain of command were absolute. During chaotic retreat, discipline erodes. Soldiers openly debate whether burning Norwegian villages serves any purpose. Some units slow-walk demolition orders, claiming they ran out of time before Soviet approach forced them to move. Other units exceed orders, destroying infrastructure not explicitly targeted. Individual moral compasses are uncalibrated. Some soldiers retain humanity and minimize destruction. Others embrace nihilism and maximize it. Leadership cannot enforce uniformity because leadership is fragmented. Officers who try maintaining discipline are ignored or told to lead by example, implying they should commit demolitions personally, which many refuse. The social contract between soldiers and commanders, we obey if you lead competently, has dissolved. Competent leadership disappeared months ago. What remains is coercion, and coercion requires more energy than disorganized retreat allows. Soviet pursuit, though officially halted at Finnish border, continues via proxy. Soviet intelligence supports Norwegian and Finnish resistance with supplies, intelligence, and coordination. Resistance attacks on German columns often coincide with Soviet artillery fire, suggesting communication between Soviet forces and resistance networks. German counterintelligence captures several resistance fighters carrying Soviet radio equipment. Under interrogation, methods documented in post-war trials as torture, fighters admit coordination with Soviet intelligence. This information confirms German suspicions but provides no tactical advantage. Knowing that resistance is Soviet-supported doesn't help German forces counter it. They lack resources for effective counterinsurgency. They lack time for systematic operations. They lack local support for intelligence gathering. The most they can do is shoot captured resistance fighters and move on. This creates additional atrocities documented by Norwegian authorities for post-war prosecutions. The Scorched Earth campaign is militarily counterproductive even by German standards. Destroying infrastructure slows German retreat more than it would slow hypothetical Soviet advance. Bridges Germans demolish must be circumvented by German forces, adding kilometers to retreat routes. Buildings Germans burn could have sheltered German wounded during evacuation. Supplies Germans destroy could have sustained German troops during withdrawal. One Wehrmacht logistics officer writes in after-action report, "We obeyed orders to implement Scorched Earth, which accomplished primary objective of denying resources to enemy. Unfortunately, we also denied resources to ourselves, creating self-inflicted supply crisis that killed more Germans than enemy action during retreat phase." This operation is case study in how ideological objectives divorced from practical reality produce self-defeating strategy. The report is filed in military archives where it remains unread until post-war researchers discover it. By then, the lessons are historical curiosities, not actionable intelligence. December 1944. Remnants of Nord, approximately 1,200 men, complete retreat into northern Norway, establishing defensive positions 250 kilometers southwest of where they started. Behind them lies devastation they created. Scorched villages, displaced populations, infrastructure destroyed. Ahead lies uncertainty. War continues, orders keep coming, but unit cohesion is destroyed and morale is non-existent. Soldiers look at burned landscape and understand they're responsible. Some rationalize, following orders, military necessity, protecting Germany. Others cannot rationalize. They know they destroyed for no reason, that civilian homes burned to satisfy Hitler's spite, that they'll be remembered not as soldiers, but as arsonists. One soldier, writing home in December, captures the moral exhaustion. I joined military to defend Germany. I find myself in Norway burning Norwegian homes because Berlin ordered it. The Norwegians we burn out were our allies 3 months ago. Nothing makes sense. Orders make no sense. The war makes no sense. I make no sense anymore. I just follow orders and wait to go home. If home still exists. If I still exist when I get there. January 19th, 1945. Official order arrives from SS headquarters. 6th SS Mountain Divisions that Nord is disbanded effective immediately. Remaining personnel will be redistributed to other SS units as needed. The division that formed in February 1941 ceases to exist in January 1945. No ceremony marks this ending. No speeches acknowledge service or sacrifice. A bureaucratic order eliminates Nord from organizational charts as cleanly as deleting a spreadsheet row. The soldiers learn about disbandment informally, orders to report to different units, rumors from headquarters personnel, eventually official announcements at company formations. For men who survived 3 years of Arctic warfare, the anticlimactic ending is somehow fitting. They fought in forgotten theater for unachievable objectives under incompetent leadership. Their division's death is equally meaningless, administrative decision made by officers who never visited the Arctic and don't understand what Nord experienced. Final strength assessment before disbandment. 1,200 combat effective personnel. Definition of combat effective has degraded significantly. It means able to hold rifle and follow basic orders, not fully trained and equipped soldier. These 1,200 men represent 6% of Nord's peak strength. Where did the other 19,800 go? Approximately 12,000 killed in action or died from wounds and environmental exposure. 8,000 evacuated for serious wounds, severe frostbite, disease, or psychiatric collapse. Most will never return to military service. 4,000 missing or captured, presumed dead. The casualty rate exceeds 90%. Comparison to other German divisions reveals how exceptional this is. Units fighting at Stalingrad suffered 80% casualties and were considered destroyed. Nord's 94% casualty rate is among highest of any German division across entire war. And most casualties didn't come from glorious last stands or desperate defenses. They came from cold, hunger, disease, and grinding attrition across 3 years of pointless stalemate. Roll call on January 25, 1945, becomes memorial service by accident. Company commanders read names of soldiers assigned to their units since 1941. Each name is followed by status: killed, wounded, missing, or present. The reading takes 90 minutes. For every name answered present, 20 names are followed by killed or missing. Soldiers stand in formation listening to recitation of the dead. Many cry openly. There's no shame in this. These are men who've watched friends die for 3 years. The names represent faces, personalities, shared experiences. Hans Weber, who froze to death in November 1941. Otto Bauer, who lost his nose to frostbite in winter 1942. Klaus Fischer, who disappeared during Soviet offensive in October 1944. 5 minutes of names, 10 minutes, 30. The list continues. By the end, everyone understands what they already knew but hadn't quantified. They're survivors of massacre conducted slowly across 36 months. The memorial ends. Officers dismiss the formation. Men return to duties. Nothing changes except now the loss is documented officially instead of just emotionally. Personnel dispersal follows bureaucratic logic that ignores human factors. Nord's survivors are distributed to units across collapsing Third Reich based on administrative needs rather than cohesion or specialization. Arctic warfare specialists are sent to urban combat units defending Berlin. Mountain warfare veterans are assigned to tank divisions lacking tanks. Medical personnel are transferred to infantry units. The institutional knowledge Nord accumulated how to survive Arctic conditions, how to fight across tundra, how to recognize frostbite's early signs, is scattered across dozens of units where it's useless. No attempt is made to keep companies or even squads together. Men who fought together for years are separated and sent to different units. The rationale is purely bureaucratic. Vacancies exist in specific units, therefore personnel are transferred to fill those vacancies. That these personnel might be more effective kept together or assigned to units where their skills matter is irrelevant. Bureaucracy serves bureaucracy, not effectiveness. Some survivors welcome disbandment. Private Werner Schmidt, who joined Nord in June 1941 as 19-year-old recruit from Munich, is transferred to Depot Unit in Bavaria, responsible for training replacements. For Schmidt, disbandment means survival. Depot units see minimal combat. He'll train recruits for 2 months before war ends, then go home. He's lucky and knows it. Others are less fortunate. Hundreds of Nord veterans are transferred to divisions defending Berlin in April 1945. They survived 3 years of Arctic warfare only to die in ruins of German capital during war's final weeks. The arbitrary cruelty of this fate is not lost on anyone. You endure frozen hell, your unit disbands, you're sent to different hell, and you die anyway. Some survivors later describe feeling cheated, as though surviving the Arctic entitled them to survive the war. But the bureaucratic dispersal revoked that entitlement. Reality is more mundane. Survival depends on luck and assignment paperwork, not on having suffered adequately in the Arctic. Division war diary and records are destroyed in April 1945. This destruction is probably intentional. Someone in SS headquarters decided Nord's history contained information better left unrecorded. War crimes in Norway, catastrophic casualty rates, command incompetence, failed offensives. These facts would embarrass the SS if documented. Better to destroy records and allow Nord to vanish from history. The destruction is not complete. Finnish liaison reports survive in Finnish archives. Norwegian documentation of atrocities survives in Norwegian files. Individual soldier diaries and letters survive in family collections. Allied intelligence captured some German documents before destruction. Post-war historians can reconstruct Nord's history, but only partially and with difficulty. Large gaps exist. Entire battalions have no reliable records. Casualty figures are estimates. The destruction of records achieves SS's goal. Nord becomes obscure, difficult to research, and easily ignored by historians focusing on better documented units. 2 Nord veterans encounter each other by chance in April 1945 amid rubble of Berlin. Unteroffizier Fritz Hermann and Gefreiter Paul Richter served in same company in 1942, but were separated during disbandment. Hermann was assigned to Berlin defense. Richter was passing through Berlin while retreating west ahead of Soviet advance. They recognize each other during artillery barrage, take shelter in same basement, and spend 4 hours waiting out bombardment. Their conversation is recorded in Richter's diary, recovered post-war. Hermann asks if any others from their company survived. Richter knows of 3, himself and 2 others, out of 180 original members. They discuss Arctic in hushed voices, as though reluctant to admit they survived what killed so many. Hermann says he dreams about the cold every night despite Berlin's warmth. Richter says he can't trust daylight anymore. After experiencing polar night, normal day-night cycles feel wrong. Artillery barrage ends. They shake hands. Hermann returns to his defensive position. Richter continues west. They never learn each other's fate. Hermann probably died defending Berlin. Richter possibly survived to American captivity. But neither knew. They were ghosts meeting briefly, acknowledging shared past, then disappearing back into chaos of collapsing Reich. The historical irony is profound. Nord was created to capture Murmansk and cut Allied supply lines. It failed completely. Murmansk operated uninterrupted for entire war. But failure didn't matter strategically because other factors determined war's outcome. German logistics couldn't sustain multi-front war. Soviet industrial capacity exceeded German capacity. American entry tilted resource balance decisively against Axis. Even if Nord had captured Murmansk, Germany would have lost. The supplies flowing through Murmansk mattered, but weren't decisive. Soviet Union could survive without them, though with greater difficulty. Nord's soldiers didn't die defending Germany. They died attempting impossible objective that wouldn't have changed war's outcome, even if achieved. This realization comes to veterans slowly, years after war ends. In 1945, they believed their sacrifice mattered. By 1960, survivors understood it didn't. The knowledge that you suffered for nothing is perhaps war's cruelest wound, worse than physical injuries because it invalidates the meaning you constructed to survive trauma. Nord's veterans carry this wound for decades. Official disbandment order contains one final bureaucratic absurdity. The order designates Nord's remnants as cadre for reconstitution when strategic situation permits. This implies Nord might be rebuilt if Germany wins territory requiring Arctic occupation. By January 1945, Germany is losing territory daily. Berlin is surrounded. The Reich is collapsing. No strategic situation will ever permit Nord's reconstitution. The phrase is bureaucratic fantasy disconnected from reality, fitting epitaph for a division created by ideological fantasy and destroyed by its collision with reality. Nord begins as experiment testing whether SS ideology can substitute for military competence. 3 years and 20,000 casualties later, the experiment concludes it cannot. But instead of acknowledging failed experiment, SS command includes language suggesting experiment might resume. This refusal to accept reality, this insistence that defeats are temporary setbacks and victory remains possible, defines Nazi Germany's final months. Nord's disbandment order embodies this delusion. The division is dead, the war is lost, but paperwork maintains fiction that both might resurrect. The paperwork lies. It always has. September 1946. Oslo District Court convenes to hear testimony in the case of Norwegian state versus former members of SS Mountain Division Nord. 23 defendants sit in the dock, former SS officers and enlisted men accused of war crimes committed during retreat through Norway in autumn 1944. The courtroom is packed. Norwegian civilians who lost homes fill the gallery. Journalists from across Europe document proceedings. This is Norway's reckoning with occupation and its particular reckoning with Nord's scorched earth campaign. The lead prosecutor is Johan Bernhard Hjort, a lawyer who spent the war in underground resistance. His opening statement is brief and devastating. The defendants claim they followed orders. We do not dispute this. We dispute that following illegal orders absolves moral responsibility. International law, military tradition, and basic humanity all recognize that some orders must be refused. The defendants chose not to refuse. We are here to determine consequences of that choice. The prosecution's case relies heavily on documentation compiled by Norwegian resistance during occupation, photographs of burning villages with German soldiers visible in frame, testimony from Norwegian civilians who watched Germans set fires, captured German documents ordering destruction. The evidence is overwhelming and specific, not vague allegations, but concrete proof linking individual defendants to particular acts. Private testimony from Kari Johansson, age 37, is representative. She describes German soldiers arriving at her family farm on November 2, 1944. An SS sergeant ordered evacuation with 15 minutes' notice. Her family loaded wagon with possessions and left. From hilltop 1 kilometer away, they watched soldiers burn their house, barn, and outbuildings. Johansson identifies the sergeant in court. He was following orders, he says. Johansson responds, I don't care about your orders. You burned my home. My children had to sleep in snow that night. Orders don't make that right. Orders just make it organized evil instead of random evil. Defense arguments reveal tension between legal responsibility and military obedience. Defense attorneys, appointed by Norwegian court, not chosen by defendants, argue that soldiers in military hierarchy lack autonomy to refuse orders without facing court-martial or execution. This argument has historical precedent and legal weight. Military discipline requires obedience. But prosecution counters with precedent from Nuremberg trials, concluded just months earlier, which established that superior orders is not absolute defense for war crimes. Judges at Nuremberg ruled that individuals retain moral responsibility even when following orders. Oslo Court applies this precedent. Chief Judge Andreas Vold rules in November 1946. Military obedience is valuable and necessary, but it is not infinite. When orders violate international law prohibiting destruction of civilian property without military necessity, soldiers must refuse or accept responsibility for compliance. These defendants chose compliance, therefore they are responsible. Sentencing reveals disparity between legal guilt and actual punishment. Of 23 defendants, all are convicted. 12 received death sentences, primarily officers and senior NCOs who gave orders or participated enthusiastically. 11 received prison terms, ranging from 3 to 20 years, primarily junior enlisted, who followed orders without evident enthusiasm. The death sentences are controversial. Some Norwegian civilians believe all defendants deserve execution. Others argue that executing soldiers for following orders sets dangerous precedent. International observers note that dozens of Nord members participated in scorched earth, but fewer than 30 faced trial. Justice is selective by necessity. Prosecuting everyone involved would require resources Norway lacks. So, trial focuses on identifiable leaders and documented cases. The 12 condemned men are executed by firing squad in March 1947. Their graves are unmarked. Norwegian authorities don't want martyrdom sites. Soviet trials proceed with less legal formality and more political purpose. Between 1945 and 1948, Soviet military tribunals try approximately 60 German soldiers captured from Nord. Charges focus on partisan massacres and anti-Soviet activities rather than destruction of Norwegian property. Evidence standards are lower than Norwegian courts. Testimony from partisan survivors is accepted without corroboration. Confessions obtained under duress are admitted. Defendants lack effective legal representation. All 60 defendants are convicted. Most receive 25-year sentences to labor camps in Siberia. Few survive the sentences. Soviet trials serve dual purposes, punishing war criminals and providing forced labor. Whether defendants actually committed alleged crimes is secondary concern. The trials are political theater demonstrating Soviet power and German guilt. Compared to Norwegian proceedings, which attempt genuine justice despite imperfections, Soviet trials are show trials with predetermined outcomes. The vast majority of Nord members who committed atrocities faced no prosecution. This is mathematical certainty, not oversight. Hundreds of German soldiers participated in scorched earth operations. Dozens participated in anti-partisan executions. But by 1946, most are dead, missing, or beyond reach of Norwegians or Soviet jurisdiction. Those who survived and reached Western occupation zones often assume false identities or simply deny service in Nord. Without comprehensive documentation, destroyed by SS before war's end, prosecutors cannot identify participants. Allied occupation authorities in Western Germany have limited interest in pursuing Norwegian war crimes when they are focused on larger atrocities like Holocaust. So, prosecution depends on chance, being captured, being identified, being located in jurisdiction, willing to prosecute. Most escape through gaps in this system. Specific example illustrates how perpetrators evade justice. Hauptsturmführer Ernst Koch commanded units that burned 18 Norwegian villages in November 1944. Norwegian resistance documented his involvement with photographs and witness testimony. But Koch wasn't captured. He retreated to Germany, assumed identity of deceased cousin, and settled in Bavaria under American occupation. Norwegian authorities request his extradition in 1947. American authorities say they cannot locate him, probably true since he's using false identity. Koch lives in Bavaria until his death in 1979. In 1963, a Norwegian survivor recognizes him at a German ski resort and reports him to German authorities. German prosecutors investigate but determine statute of limitations has expired for charges not involving murder. Since Koch ordered property destruction but didn't personally kill anyone, he cannot be prosecuted under German law. He lives another 16 years. Norwegian survivors know he's there, unpunished, living comfortably on German pension. The knowledge creates lasting bitterness. Cold War politics interfere with justice in predictable ways. By 1949, Western Germany is potential ally against Soviet Union. Western occupation authorities, especially Americans, prioritized rebuilding West German military and intelligence services over prosecuting war criminals. Former Wehrmacht and SS officers are recruited for their expertise. Some Nord veterans find employment in nascent West German military or intelligence services. Their service in Arctic is considered valuable experience. Their participation in atrocities is quietly overlooked. This pattern repeats across post-war Germany. Practical necessity trumps justice. Norwegian and Soviet protests are acknowledged and ignored. Western authorities explain that they are balancing multiple interests: justice for past crimes versus security against future Soviet aggression. Victims find this explanation unsatisfying. The Norwegians who lost homes don't care about Cold War strategy. They want accountability. They mostly don't get it. The inadequacy of post-war justice creates lasting trauma for survivors. Kari Johansen, who testified in Oslo trials, is interviewed in 1982. She's 73 years old. 38 years have passed since German soldiers burned her home. She still becomes angry discussing it. Justice means the guilty are punished proportionate to crime. 12 men were executed for burning thousands of homes. How is that proportionate? The sergeant who burned my house specifically wasn't among the 12. He probably lived comfortably in Germany. That's not justice. That's administrative tidiness. We prosecuted enough people to demonstrate we tried, but not enough to actually deliver justice. I understand why: limited resources, missing defendants, political priorities. Understanding doesn't make it fair. Her sentiment is widely shared among Norwegian survivors. They appreciate the trials that occurred, but they cannot forget the trials that didn't. The absence of comprehensive accountability becomes its own form of ongoing injustice. Comparison across different national approaches to Nord prosecution reveals no satisfying model. Norwegian courts attempt legitimate justice but can only prosecute accessible defendants, resulting in symbolic justice for some victims but not comprehensive accountability. Soviet courts prosecute more aggressively, but with compromised procedures that make convictions morally questionable, even when defendants are probably guilty. Western occupation authorities largely don't prosecute, prioritizing Cold War strategy over historical justice. Each approach has justifications. Each approach fails most victims. The lesson, if there is one, is that post-war justice for mass atrocity is always inadequate. Legal systems designed for individual crimes cannot process collective guilt. Punishing thousands is impractical. Punishing dozens is symbolic, and symbols satisfy law, but not justice. Nord's victims learned this lesson. It's not the lesson they wanted to learn, but history teaches what it teaches, not what we wish it taught. By 1950, prosecution largely ends. Most surviving Nord members are dead, imprisoned, or living under assumed identities. The moment for comprehensive accountability passes. What remains is memory, bitterness, and unresolved questions about moral responsibility in military hierarchies. These questions persist. They're still unresolved today. June 2004. A historian named Dr. Markus Pöhlmann sits in Bundesarchiv Militär, Archiv in Freiburg, Germany, researching Arctic warfare in World War II. He requests files for 6th SS Mountain Division Nord. The archivist returns with 2 boxes, approximately 3 cubic feet of documents. For comparison, files for 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich occupy 27 boxes. Files for 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte occupy 40 boxes. Nord's files are 15% the size of comparable divisions. Pöhlmann opens the first box and immediately understands why. Large gaps exist in documentation. Entire months have no records. After-action reports that should exist are missing. War diaries that military regulations required are absent. Someone destroyed these documents deliberately. The destruction wasn't complete. Enough survives to reconstruct basic history, but it was systematic. Perlman will spend 2 years researching Nord, consulting Finnish and Norwegian archives to fill gaps. He'll publish a scholarly article that maybe 300 people read. Nord remains obscure despite his efforts. The question is why? Historiographic analysis reveals systematic neglect of Arctic theater across World War II scholarship. Academic databases containing military history publications show stark disparity. Searching Battle of Stalingrad returns approximately 1,200 academic articles and 450 books. Searching Arctic Front World War II returns 70 articles and 12 books. Searching 6th SS Mountain Division Nord specifically returns 8 articles and 2 books, 1 in Norwegian, 1 in Finnish, neither translated to English. This disparity reflects broader pattern. Historians focus on theaters with decisive battles, clear narratives, and abundant sources. Arctic theater has none of these. Battles were small scale. Narrative is stalemate without resolution. Sources were deliberately destroyed or are scattered across Norwegian, Finnish, Soviet, and German archives in multiple languages. Researching Nord requires visiting 4 countries, reading 3 languages, and reconstructing incomplete records. Most historians choose easier topics. The result is historical amnesia, where entire front disappears from collective memory. Popular history amplifies this neglect exponentially. Television documentaries about World War II number in thousands. Documentaries about Arctic Front number in dozens. Most focus on Allied convoy battles, ships sinking, submarines attacking, because maritime warfare provides dramatic visuals. Ground combat in Arctic rarely appears because it lacks visual archive. German and Soviet forces in Arctic didn't prioritize combat photography. What footage exists is poor quality, grainy, underexposed, showing men in trenches looking cold. This doesn't make compelling television. Modern documentary producers need dramatic visuals, clear heroes and villains, and narratives that resolve. Arctic Front provides none of this. So, producers focus on D-Day, which has all 3. The result? Millions of people can describe D-Day in detail but have never heard of Pittsburgh-Kirkenes offensive, despite it being larger in scale and strategic importance than many famous battles. Comparison of bookshelf space reveals physical manifestation of historical neglect. A moderately comprehensive World War II library might contain 200 books. Typical breakdown: 40 books on Eastern Front generally, 30 on Holocaust, 25 on Western Front, 20 on Pacific Theater, 15 on Air War, 10 on Naval War, 10 on Home Fronts, 50 on miscellaneous topics. How many on Arctic Front? Usually 0, maybe 1 if the collector is thorough. The Arctic Front constitutes less than half of 1% of typical World War II library, despite involving hundreds of thousands of troops across 4 years. This disproportion reflects market forces. Publishers print what sells, readers buy what they know. They know what they've heard about. They've heard about topics covered extensively in other media. Arctic Front creates vicious cycle. Minimal coverage leads to minimal public knowledge. Minimal knowledge leads to minimal demand. Minimal demand leads to minimal coverage. Norwegian archives preserve what German archives destroyed, but Norwegian sources remain inaccessible to most researchers. Riksarkivet, Norwegian National Archives, contains extensive documentation of German occupation, including detailed records of Nord's activities compiled by resistance networks. These records include photographs, witness testimonies, captured German documents, and post-war investigation reports. But the material is cataloged in Norwegian, requires on-site research, and hasn't been digitized. Researchers must travel to Oslo, spend weeks reviewing physical documents, and translate Norwegian sources. This creates access barrier that prevents widespread research. Dr. Perlman's work relied heavily on Norwegian archives, but few historians have resources to replicate his effort. The result? Norwegian sources exist but remain functionally inaccessible to international scholarship. Knowledge exists but stays localized in Norway, unknown elsewhere. Soviet archives were classified until 1990s. creating decades-long gap in accessible research materials. During Cold War, Soviet records of Arctic front were state secrets. Western historians couldn't access them. Soviet historians could access them, but operated under ideological constraints that prevented honest assessment. Only after Soviet Union's collapse did archives open partially. Even then, access was inconsistent and incomplete. Some records were declassified. Others remained restricted. Researchers needed special permissions. The sudden availability of Soviet sources in 1990s should have sparked research renaissance. It didn't, because by 1990s, World War II historiography had established patterns. Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad were thoroughly researched. Publishers wanted books on new topics, not reassessment of obscure theaters. Soviet archival opening came too late to shift historical focus. Finnish perspective offers most complete picture, but reaches smallest audience. Finnish historians documented continuation war, Finland's 1941-44 conflict with Soviet Union, extensively including Finnish-German cooperation in Arctic. Finnish military archives contain liaison reports, intelligence assessments, and observations of German operations. Finnish historians publish scholarly works in Finnish and Swedish, languages understood by approximately 7 million people globally. These works are excellent, but linguistically isolated. Researchers who don't read Finnish or Swedish cannot access them. A handful have been translated to German. Almost none exist in English. This language barrier creates a situation where best scholarship on Nord exists, but remains unknown to 99% of potential readers. Knowledge exists in wrong language for widespread dissemination. Modern archaeological work is slowly reversing historical neglect, but reaches limited audience. Since 2000, Norwegian and Finnish teams have excavated former battlefield sites in Arctic. They've recovered artifacts, documented trench systems, and located remains of German and Soviet soldiers. This work generates local media coverage, but minimal international attention. Archaeological findings are published in specialist journals, read by maybe 500 people globally. Television documentaries occasionally feature Arctic archaeology, but frame it as human interest story. Frozen battlefields reveal lost soldiers, rather than serious historical analysis. The work is valuable. It preserves physical evidence before climate change destroys it, but it doesn't fundamentally change Nord's status as forgotten division. Most people still haven't heard of Nord. Archaeological discoveries don't reach them. The question remains, why does historical erasure matter? Nord's story doesn't change World War II's outcome. Germany lost, regardless of Nord's success or failure. Allied victory didn't depend on Arctic front. So, does it matter that Nord is forgotten? The answer depends on why we study history. If history exists only to explain outcomes, then Nord doesn't matter. It's historical footnote. But if history exists to understand human experience under extreme conditions, to learn from failures, to remember suffering, then Nord matters immensely. 20,000 men spent years in frozen hell fighting for objectives that didn't matter under leaders who were incompetent executing strategy that couldn't work. They suffered not because their suffering was necessary, but because ideology blinded leadership to reality. This pattern, ideological certainty producing preventable catastrophe, repeats throughout history. Understanding Nord means understanding how it happens. Forgetting Nord means forgetting the lesson. Maybe that's why history ignores Nord. The lesson is uncomfortable. It suggests that belief, determination, and sacrifice are insufficient when strategy is flawed. That's not the story we want to hear. We prefer narratives where suffering has meaning, where sacrifice achieves something, where the brave triumph. Nord offers none of this. Nord offers only the cold truth that you can do everything right at individual level and still die pointlessly because someone far away made bad decisions. That truth is uncomfortable, so we forget it. And by forgetting it, we ensure future generations will learn it the same hard way Nord did. 1987. Klaus Becker sits in his Munich apartment being interviewed for oral history project documenting World War II veterans. He's 65 years old. He joined Nord in June 1941 as 18-year-old conscript. He survived 3 years in Arctic, rare accomplishment, and 42 years afterward. but he's never spoken publicly about his service. His family knows he was in SS, knows he served in Norway, knows he doesn't discuss it. The interviewer, a graduate student named Andrea Scholl, asks simple question. Can you describe a typical day in the Arctic? Becker is silent for 47 seconds. Scholl waits. Finally, Becker speaks. There was no typical day. Every day was survival. You wake up cold. You do your duties cold. You sleep cold. The cold never stops. It gets inside you. Even now, 40 years later, I'm cold. My wife keeps apartment at 23 degrees, and I wear a sweater. The Arctic took something from me that never came back. I survived. But part of me is still frozen up there. Testimony reveals that Nord veterans speak about environment more than combat. In interviews conducted between 1980 and 2000, approximately 150 recorded testimonies from Nord survivors, 80% spend more time describing cold, darkness, and isolation than describing battles. This pattern is striking. Veterans of other theaters emphasize combat, specific firefights, tactical situations, enemy encounters. Nord veterans emphasize existence, how they stayed warm, what they ate, how they coped with darkness. When asked directly about combat, responses are brief. When asked about environment, responses are detailed and emotional. One interpretation: combat in Arctic was less traumatic than simply being in Arctic. Another interpretation: combat trauma is universal across wars, but environmental trauma from Arctic is unique and therefore more salient in memory. Either way, testimony suggests Nord's experience was defined more by location than by fighting. Soviet perspectives emerged slowly after Cold War ends. Between 1946 and 1990, Soviet veterans of Arctic Front rarely gave public interviews. State control of narrative prevented honest discussion of wartime experiences. After Soviet collapse, restrictions eased. Oral history projects in Russia recorded several dozen testimonies from veterans who fought against Nord. Their descriptions of Germans are surprisingly sympathetic. Dmitry Volkov, who served in 14th Army from 1941 to 44, recalls, "We called them frozen fascists, but without malice. They were as miserable as we were. After battles, we'd find their dead, and they looked like our dead. Just cold, hungry boys far from home. They had better weapons, but worse clothing. We had worse weapons, but better clothing. We both had orders to fight over land neither side wanted. There's a German proverb, Der Krieg ist ein schlechter Meister. War is a bad master. We learned that together in the Arctic." Norwegian civilian testimony provides third perspective. Approximately 500 Norwegians lived in Finnmark during German occupation. Most were forcibly evacuated in October 1944. In decades afterward, many gave interviews describing occupation experience. Testimony reveals complexity that simple victim-perpetrator narrative cannot capture. Ingrid Hansen, who was 16 in 1941, recalls German soldier billeted in her family's home. His name was Joseph. He was from Austria. He played violin. Some evenings he'd play folk songs. My father, who hated Germans, would listen. Joseph told us he didn't believe in Hitler's ideas, but refused military service meant prison or worse. He was trapped, like we were trapped. Then, in October 1944, different soldiers came. SS security, not Joseph, and burned our house. Joseph's unit had moved months before. I never learned what happened to him, probably died in retreat or after. I think about him sometimes. He was enemy, but also just a person caught in history. Finnish veterans offer the most nuanced perspectives because they fought alongside Germans and then against them. Pekka Virtanen, the Finnish liaison officer who appears throughout Nord's history, survived war and gave extensive interview in 1994, year before his death. Age 86, memories still sharp. Germans were our allies of necessity. We needed them against Soviets. They needed us for local knowledge and legitimacy. But alliance was always uncomfortable. German officers treated us as inferiors despite needing our help. They ignored our advice and failed predictably. When we changed sides in 1944, I felt relief more than guilt. We'd watch Germans destroy themselves through arrogance and rigidity. Fighting them was sad. Many German soldiers were decent men, but necessary. Germany had become liability, not asset. Virtanen's testimony includes remarkable admission. If Germany had won, Finland would have become satellite state. We understood this. So German defeat was actually good for Finland, despite the cost. History is full of such ironies. Psychological impact testimonies reveal long-term damage that transcends physical wounds. Multiple Nord veterans describe symptoms consistent with PTSD, though they don't use that term. Nightmares about cold, difficulty trusting daylight, hypervigilance in normal environments, emotional numbing, survivor guilt. Hans Weber, interviewed 1991. I sleep with 4 blankets even in summer. I check weather compulsively. I become anxious when days get shorter in autumn. I know these behaviors are irrational. I know I'm in Germany, not the Arctic. I know I'm safe. But knowledge doesn't help. My nervous system remembers the Arctic even though I want to forget. I'm 70 years old and still controlled by experiences from 50 years ago. The war took 3 years of my life then. It's taken 50 years of my life since. Moral complexity emerges in testimonies about atrocities. Several Nord veterans admit participating in scorched earth operations, while expressing ambivalence about their actions. Ernst Müller, interviewed 1988. I burned Norwegian houses in November 1944. I followed orders. But I knew it was wrong. I wasn't brave enough to refuse, so I'm guilty. Not legally, I was never prosecuted, but morally. I live with that. Some veterans claim they had no choice. That's not true. We had choice. Obey and live or refuse and face punishment. We chose to obey. We chose our lives over Norwegian civilians' homes. That's human maybe, but it's not admirable. I don't ask forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want my grandchildren to understand that ordinary people commit evil when systems make evil the path of least resistance. The reunion of former enemies in 1995 provides unexpected perspective. Norwegian government organizes memorial service at Arctic battlefield site. German, Russian, Norwegian, and Finnish veterans attend. Approximately 40 survivors, average age 75. What happens when men who tried killing each other meet 50 years later? The answer surprises organizers. Immediate camaraderie. Björn Olsen, Norwegian resistance fighter, embraces Klaus Schmidt, former Nord soldier. They share stories. They discover they fought near same locations in October 1944, possibly shot at each other. They laugh about absurdity of war. We tried to kill each other over land nobody wanted. Memorial service includes minute of silence for all dead, German, Soviet, Norwegian, Finnish. No nationality is specified. The dead are just the dead. After ceremony, veterans exchange addresses. Some maintain correspondence for years afterward. Werner Braun, German veteran, writes to Russian veteran in 1998. We were enemies once, but the real enemy was the cold, the orders, the systems that sent young men to die in meaningless places. I'm glad we both survived to understand this. Common themes emerge across all testimonies, regardless of nationality. First, the Arctic was worse than the war. Second, orders from distant commanders were often stupid. Third, individual soldiers on all sides were human beings, not monsters. Fourth, survivor guilt is real and lasting. Fifth, the war's meaning, if it had any, is still unclear decades later. These themes complicate simple narratives about World War II. We prefer stories where sides are clearly good or evil, where suffering has purpose, where veterans find meaning in their service. Nord testimonies resist these narratives. The Germans weren't heroes. They fought for evil regime and committed crimes. But they also suffered in ways that deserve acknowledgement. The Soviets weren't purely victims. They also committed atrocities and fought for repressive dictatorship. Norwegians and Finns weren't just innocent bystanders. They made choices that enabled or resisted occupation. Everyone was complicit in something, victim of something, morally complicated in ways that resist easy judgment. This complexity is testimony's greatest value. They prevent simplification. They force recognition that war involves human beings, not archetypes. And human beings are always more complicated than categories allow. Final testimony comes from Scholl herself, the oral historian who interviewed dozens of Nord veterans. In her dissertation published 2001, she reflects, "Interviewing Nord veterans changed how I understand history. Before this project, I thought history was about facts, what happened, when, why. But Nord testimonies taught me that history is also about meaning, or lack of meaning. These men can describe what they experienced with great precision, but they cannot explain why it mattered. They know they suffered. They don't know what the suffering accomplished. That absence of meaning haunts them more than the physical experiences. We want wars to have meaning. We construct narratives post facto to give suffering purpose. But Nord veterans resist this. They say, it happened, it was awful, it meant nothing. That's the truth, and truth is often uncomfortable. Her reflection captures Nord's legacy. It's a story about meaninglessness in an era that demands meaning. That's why it's forgotten. That's why it matters. March 2022. NATO soldiers conduct cold weather warfare exercise in northern Norway, 50 kilometers from where Nord fought 80 years earlier. The exercise, Cold Response 2022, involves 30,000 troops from 27 nations. Objectives include testing Arctic warfare capabilities and demonstrating NATO presence in region of increasing strategic importance. Exercise planners explicitly reference historical lessons from World War II Arctic campaigns. A planning document states, historical analysis of German operations 1941 to 44 demonstrates that Arctic warfare requires specialized training, proper equipment, and realistic operational planning. German failures in these areas resulted in catastrophic casualties. NATO must learn from these failures to ensure modern forces don't repeat them. Nord's failure has become teaching tool, cautionary tale about what happens when armies ignore environmental realities. The question is whether modern militaries have actually learned these lessons or merely cite them while repeating same mistakes with better technology. Climate change has fundamentally altered Arctic strategic calculus. Between 1980 and 2020, Arctic sea ice extent decreased approximately 13% per decade. This creates two related effects: new maritime shipping routes through previously impassable waters, and access to oil and gas resources formerly locked under ice. Multiple nations, Russia, United States, Canada, Norway, China, assert competing interests in Arctic. Russia has militarized its Arctic frontier extensively, building new bases and deploying advanced systems. NATO responds with increased exercises and deployments. The result? Arctic is militarizing for first time since Cold War ended. Historical parallel to German-Soviet Arctic front is obvious and frequently noted by military analysts. Carl Forsyth, analyst at Royal United Services Institute, writes in 2021, "We are witnessing militarization of Arctic driven by resource competition and maritime access, precisely the factors that made Murmansk strategically vital in 1941. The difference is technology. The similarity is that whoever controls Arctic maritime routes and resource access gains significant strategic advantage. History suggests powers will fight over this advantage. Modern equipment reduces environmental risks but doesn't eliminate them. NATO soldiers in Cold Response 2022 have advanced cold weather gear, synthetic insulation, moisture-wicking base layers, boots rated to -50 Celsius. They have GPS navigation, satellite communication, heated shelters. They don't suffer frostbite in same numbers as World War II soldiers, but they still suffer. Exercise after action reports document approximately 30% of participants experience cold weather injuries, primarily mild frostbite and hypothermia, despite best available equipment. Investigation reveals causes: soldiers underestimating environmental danger, equipment failure in extreme conditions, operational tempo preventing proper rest and recovery. Exercise Commander's report concludes, technology extends human capability in cold environments, but does not make humans Arctic capable without proper training and respect for environmental limitations. Historical lesson from German Arctic operations remains valid. The environment is an enemy equal to any human adversary. This lesson costs NATO 0 fatalities during exercise. It costs Nord thousands of fatalities during war, but the lesson is the same. Russian Arctic doctrine explicitly addresses World War II lessons. Russian military writings from 2010 onward frequently reference defense of Murmansk and Pitsamokirkenes. Offensive is validating Russian approach to Arctic warfare. Russian analysis emphasizes that Soviet success in World War II resulted from preparation, proper equipment, local knowledge, and willingness to accept that Arctic warfare differs from warfare elsewhere. Colonel Dmitry Kozlov, Russian military analyst, writes in 2015, German arrogance in 1941, belief that superior training and ideology could overcome material conditions, led to predictable failure. Modern militaries must understand that Arctic imposes unique constraints. Mobility is reduced. Supply lines are vulnerable. Technology fails in cold. The military that acknowledges these constraints and adapts accordingly will dominate Arctic conflicts. The military that ignores them will repeat German failures. Russian doctrine builds on this analysis. Extensive investment in Arctic bases, specialized training for units designated for Arctic deployment, equipment designed for polar conditions, and strategy that prioritizes defense over offensive operations in Arctic terrain. Chinese interest in Arctic creates wildcard in strategic calculations. China has no Arctic territory but significant economic interests. Potential shipping routes through Arctic reduce distance between Chinese ports and European markets by approximately 20% compared to current routes through Suez Canal. Chinese companies invest in Arctic mining and energy extraction. Chinese research stations operate in Svalbard under treaty allowing international scientific presence. Chinese military writings discuss Arctic as fourth pole, after North, South, and Central terrestrial poles, requiring strategic attention. Western analysts debate whether Chinese interest is purely economic or includes military dimensions. Historical parallel is instructive. Germany believed Murmansk mattered strategically in 1941 because it controlled supply routes, and that belief proved correct even though German operations to capture it failed. China may believe Arctic matters strategically for same reason. If so, Chinese military presence in Arctic is likely question of when, not if. Technology changes Arctic warfare in ways both predictable and surprising. Predictable. Modern surveillance makes concealment difficult. Satellites detect troop movements. Thermal imaging identifies heat signatures. Electronic intelligence intercepts communications. Nord could disappear into Arctic vastness. Modern forces cannot. Surprising. Technology also creates new vulnerabilities. Batteries fail in extreme cold. Satellite reception is unreliable at high latitudes. Electronics malfunction. Lubricants freeze. These failures sometimes negate technological advantages and return warfare to World War II era basics. Soldiers with rifles navigating by map and compass. Exercise reports from NATO. Arctic exercises document frequent technology failures requiring low-tech backup systems. The lesson: Arctic warfare in 21st century combines high technology with World War II era fallbacks. Armies that rely exclusively on technology without maintaining basic skills repeat German mistake of assuming technical superiority compensates for environmental challenges. Strategic question remains: can Arctic be held? Nord demonstrated that Arctic defensive lines are holdable. Static defense succeeded where offensive operations failed. But Nord also demonstrated that holding territory in Arctic requires enormous resource investment for minimal strategic gain. Russia demonstrated in 2022 Ukraine conflict that sustaining multi-front wars strains even large militaries. Arctic operations would strain logistics even more severely than Ukraine operations. Western military planners acknowledge this. A NATO strategy emphasizes rapid response and territorial denial rather than permanent garrison. The implicit assumption, nobody can hold Arctic effectively. so strategy focuses on preventing adversaries from holding it. This is lesson from Nord's failure inverted. Instead of asking how to take and hold Arctic territory, modern strategy asks how to prevent anyone else from doing so. The distinction matters. Nord died trying to hold ground that couldn't be held. Modern forces, in theory, have learned not to try. Geopolitical competition echoes 1940s, but with important differences. Then, Germany and Soviet Union fought over Arctic because it provided routes for Allied supply convoys. Now, multiple powers compete over Arctic because it provides maritime routes for commercial shipping and access to natural resources. The competition is more complex, more parties involved, more types of interests at stake, more international law governing claims. But underlying logic is similar. Control of Arctic provides strategic and economic advantages, therefore Arctic becomes contested space. Historical memory of World War II. Arctic front influences modern competition in subtle ways. Russian propaganda emphasizes that Russia successfully defended Arctic against Nazi aggression, reinforcing claim to Arctic primacy. NATO planning references historical lessons from German failures to justify preparedness and caution. Norway and Finland, both World War II veterans of Arctic warfare, position themselves as experienced Arctic powers whose knowledge provides strategic value to NATO. History is weaponized, used to support current claims and delegitimize adversaries' claims. In this sense, Nord's legacy is not dead history, but live political tool. The fundamental question is whether modern militaries have internalized Nord's lessons or merely cited them. Evidence is mixed. On positive side, NATO conducts regular Arctic exercises, invests in specialized equipment, emphasizes training. Russian forces deploy Arctic specialized units with proper equipment and preparation. Nobody is sending temperate-trained units into Arctic without preparation. The mistake Germany made in 1941. On negative side, strategic assumptions sometimes mirror German assumptions. Belief that technology compensates for environmental challenges echoes German belief that training and ideology compensated for inadequate preparation. Emphasis on offensive capability echoes German emphasis on aggressive action over careful planning. Tendency to underestimate logistical challenges echoes German underestimation of supply difficulties. These parallels suggest that institutional learning is incomplete. Militaries have learned tactical lessons, proper equipment, specialized training, but may not have fully internalized strategic lesson. Arctic warfare is fundamentally different from warfare elsewhere and requires different operational concepts, not just different equipment. Whether this partial learning suffices will be tested only if Arctic conflict actually occurs. Until then, Nord's lessons remain theoretical warnings rather than practical guides. The hope is that the warnings suffice to prevent repetition. The fear is that they won't. History suggests that humans learn from history very slowly and incompletely. Nord demonstrated what happens when armies ignore environmental realities. Modern militaries know Nord's story. Whether they've truly understood it remains to be seen. August 2018. Dr. Henrik Olsen, the archaeologist from Chapter 1, completes excavation of Klaus Becker's position. He's recovered Becker's diary, frozen but legible. The final entry from November 1941 remains incomplete. But Olsen has also recovered other artifacts: letters from home never delivered, photographs of family, a pocket Bible, and Becker's identity disc. Using these, Olsen contacts German military archives and eventually locates Becker's family. They thought Klaus died in 1941, but never received confirmation. 77 years later, they finally know his fate. Becker has no living siblings or parents. They've all died. But he has a niece, now 63 years old, who never met her uncle. Olsen gives her the diary. She reads it. She cries. "I knew the war was terrible," she says. "I didn't know it was this terrible. He was 20 years old. He froze to death in a trench in Norway for what?" Olsen has no answer. Nobody does. That question, for what, is Nord's epitaph. Statistical summary reveals Nord's story in numbers. 20,300 German soldiers deployed to 6th SS Mountain Division Nord between February 1941 and January 1945. Of these, 12,300 killed or died of wounds, 8,500 evacuated for serious injuries or illness, 4,100 missing or captured, 1,200 survived to disbandment in January 1945. Survival rate, 6%. For comparison, German military overall had approximately 25% survival rate. Nord's casualties were 4 times higher than typical German division. Soviet casualties facing Nord, estimated 10,000 killed, 15,000 wounded. Norwegian civilian casualties from Nord operations, approximately 1,200 dead from direct violence and secondary effects of scorched earth. Finnish casualties in Lapland War, fighting against Nord, approximately 770 killed. Total human cost of Nord's deployment, approximately 30,000 dead on all sides. And for what strategic gain? 0. Murmansk operated continuously throughout war. Allied supplies flowed. Soviet resistance didn't collapse. Nord achieved nothing its deployment intended. The fundamental question is why Nord failed so catastrophically. Multiple factors contributed. Inadequate preparation for Arctic conditions, supply line vulnerabilities, ideological command structure prioritizing loyalty over competence, tactical rigidity, numerical disadvantage, fighting on terrain favoring defenders, strategic objectives that were achievable only with resources Germany didn't allocate. But underneath these factors lies deeper cause: leadership's refusal to accept that some objectives are impossible regardless of will or courage. Hitler believed capturing Murmansk was critical. He was correct. He also believed Nord could capture it with existing resources. He was wrong. But admitting he was wrong meant admitting his strategic judgment was flawed, which Nazi ideology couldn't permit. So the mission continued despite accumulating evidence of impossibility. Soldiers died because leadership couldn't acknowledge reality. This is Nord's core lesson. When ideology blinds leadership to reality, everyone suffers. The soldiers understand this. They understand their suffering accomplished nothing. And that knowledge, the certainty of meaningless sacrifice, is perhaps war's cruelest wound. Modern memorial services attempt to give Nord's sacrifice meaning it didn't have during war. Since 2000, Norwegian government has held annual ceremonies at Arctic battlefield sites. Veterans attend when able. Their numbers decline annually as age and death reduce survivor population. Memorial speeches emphasize reconciliation, learning from history, honoring sacrifice regardless of nation. These are appropriate sentiments for peace ceremony, but they risk sanitizing history by imposing meaning retrospectively. Nord's soldiers didn't sacrifice for reconciliation. They fought for Nazi empire. Their suffering doesn't automatically gain moral value through passage of time. The appropriate way to honor them is not to sanctify their sacrifice, but to acknowledge its futility and learn from it. The memorial that matters isn't the stone monument at battlefield site. The memorial is the lesson. Don't repeat this. Don't send soldiers to achieve impossible objectives. Don't let ideology override judgment. Don't sacrifice lives for pride and face-saving. That lesson honors the dead more than any ceremony. Comparative context reveals Nord's place in larger history of military failure. Gallipoli campaign in World War I. Allied forces attempted landing on Turkish coast, failed catastrophically, suffered similar casualty rates as Nord. Charge of Light Brigade in Crimean War. British cavalry charged Russian positions due to miscommunication and stubbornness. Suffered 90% casualties achieving nothing. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, French forces advanced deep into Russia, defeated tactically, destroyed strategically by winter, and overextended supply lines. The pattern is consistent. Competent soldiers led by flawed strategy suffer preventable casualties, achieving nothing. Nord isn't unique, it's representative. And the representation matters because it demonstrates that military competence at individual level cannot compensate for incompetence at strategic level. German soldiers in Nord were not cowards. Their tactics were not primitive. But tactics don't matter when strategy is wrong. This distinction is crucial. Post-war narratives sometimes suggest Allied victory resulted from German incompetence. More accurately, Allied victory resulted from German strategic overreach combined with Allied material superiority. German forces fought effectively within constraints, but constraints imposed by strategic decisions made effective fighting insufficient. Philosophical reflection on Nord's legacy requires confronting uncomfortable truths. First truth: suffering doesn't automatically have meaning. We want to believe that if someone suffered, their suffering must have mattered, but Nord demonstrates otherwise. Soldiers suffered enormously. Their suffering mattered to them personally and to families who lost them. But it didn't matter strategically. It didn't change war's outcome. It didn't achieve objectives. Suffering can be meaningless. That's terrifying to acknowledge, but necessary to understand war honestly. Second truth: morality and effectiveness are separate. Nord committed atrocities in Norway. Those atrocities were immoral. But the atrocities also didn't help Germany win. Immorality didn't cause military failure. Strategic incompetence did. This distinction is important. We prefer to believe that evil causes failure and good causes success. Reality is messier. Evil and failure are separate variables that sometimes correlate and sometimes don't. The environment's role deserves final emphasis. Nord's story is fundamentally about humans fighting environment. Soviets were adversaries but not primary enemy. The primary enemy was cold, darkness, distance, terrain. These enemies don't negotiate. They don't retreat. They don't feel pity. They simply exist and kill whatever cannot adapt. Nord couldn't adapt, because adaptation would require admitting that environment mattered more than ideology, which SS doctrine couldn't permit. So they fought environment using tools designed for human enemies: courage, determination, discipline. These are valuable against human adversaries. They're worthless against -40 Celsius. The lesson transcends military context. In any struggle against natural forces, climate change, pandemics, natural disasters, human qualities like bravery and resolve matter, less than realistic assessment and proper preparation. Nature doesn't care about courage. It only responds to adaptation. Nord died because they brought courage to fight that required adaptation. We honor their courage. We should learn from their failure. Final question: should Nord be forgotten? Arguments for forgetting. They fought for evil regime, committed atrocities, achieved nothing worth remembering, and perpetuating their memory might glorify Nazi ideology. Arguments against forgetting. They were human beings who suffered. Their failure teaches valuable lessons. Forgetting them risks repeating their mistakes, and honest history requires acknowledging all aspects of past, including uncomfortable ones. The correct answer balances these considerations. Remember Nord, but remember accurately. Don't romanticize. Don't ignore atrocities. Don't pretend suffering was noble. But also, don't erase. Remember that 20,000 men went to Arctic believing they served important purpose. Remember they died mostly from cold and misery rather than combat. Remember their failure resulted from strategic stupidity combined with ideological rigidity. Remember that environment defeated them as thoroughly as any enemy could. And remember that similar failures will recur if we don't learn from history. The Arctic itself provides final perspective. The tundra where Nord fought looks similar today to how it looked in 1941. Trenches have eroded, bunkers have collapsed, equipment has rusted, but landscape endures essentially unchanged. Climate change is warming Arctic faster than temperate regions, but fundamental character remains: cold, remote, unforgiving. This permanence puts human struggles in perspective. Nord thought they were fighting for permanent German empire that would last 1,000 years. That empire collapsed in 4 years. The Arctic is still the Arctic. Humans come, fight, die, and are forgotten. The land remains. This is not nihilism, but realism. Human conflicts matter to humans. Suffering is real, consequences affect lives and societies. But in geological time, in environmental perspective, these conflicts are momentary disturbances. The Arctic doesn't remember Germans or Soviets or anyone else. It simply exists, white, empty, eternal. Nord's soldiers learned this truth but couldn't articulate it. We can articulate it and should. We are small, temporary, and ultimately powerless against forces larger than ourselves. The question is not whether we control these forces, we don't, but whether we respect them. Nor didn't respect the Arctic. The Arctic killed them. That's the final lesson. That's the requiem for the forgotten.